time a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Greetings, fellow multiversal adventurers. It's an honor to have you back in this saga that has us all hooked. Official channel statement: this story is 100% epic fiction. So please don't attempt real magic, the results aren't guaranteed and insurance won't cover it. The rights to this masterpiece belong entirely to its brilliant original author. We are just a barge sharing it with you. Do you want to keep being part of this amazing community? Join our ninja army of subscribers on YouTube and give this content a like. And for true fans, our Patreon has exclusive ninjutsu waiting for you. Chapter 601: Basic Air Combat Knowledge. The British acted swiftly. The distance from Dunkirk to Namur is approximately 200 kilometers, typically taking 5 or 6 hours by train, plus at least 7 or 8 hours for loading. However, the first batch of supplies arrived in Namur and was delivered to the airport in just 4 hours. This was Kitchener's achievement, though he was now in a predicament. Requesting air reinforcements from Charles was not Lieutenant General Avis's idea, but rather Kitchener's, the Emperor of the world, who, unwilling to lower the head of the world's leading superpower, had Lieutenant General Avis contact Charles. Kitchener's planned trip to the Somme was, of course, cancelled. Compared to the defeat at Antwerp, the stalemate at the Somme was insignificant. Kitchener considered one point: Charles had created miracles at Antwerp twice. The first time, he single-handedly entered Antwerp and commanded the collapsing Belgian army to decisive victory over the Germans. The second time, he led the French 1st Panzer Corps to capture Antwerp in just one day and established a current Antwerp line. This victory was even included in textbooks by various countries as a classic example. But now, the British Army had just forced Charles's troops out of Antwerp under the pretext of segmented defense, and was immediately routed by the Germans. How could Field Marshal Kitchener explain this to Albert I? How could the British Army face the Belgian and French armies? How would the colonial armies view the British Army? No, this cannot continue. Kitchener gave a firm order Lieutenant General Avis to hold Antwerp at all costs, but this order alone was far from enough. Unlike Haig, Kitchener knew the importance of new equipment such as airplanes and tanks. He believed that the most important thing to turn the tide of the war was air superiority, or at least preventing the Germans from gaining complete air superiority. Therefore, after receiving Charles's promise, Kitchener immediately took charge in his capacity as British First Secretary of State for War, ordering all idle trains on the railway to give way, thus delivering the first batch of supplies to Namur within hours. When Charles received the list of supplies, it consisted mostly of aviation fuel and machine gun ammunition, along with some food. Clearly, this was preparation for Charles's air regiment to engage in combat. But Charles wasn't so easily persuaded now. Winning the air battle and turning the tide of the war for the British wasn't going to be a free lunch. Charles hesitated for a moment before sending a telegram to Lieutenant General Avis, patiently explaining some basic air combat knowledge. The supplies have been received, thank you very much, Your Excellency. However, it seems you sent them to the wrong place. Air combat is about proximity. For example, to reinforce Antwerp, the best takeoff base for the aircraft should be Brussels, not Namur. Taking off from Namur adds about 50 kilometers to the distance, making it 100 kilometers round trip, which has a significant impact on air combat. This extra 100 kilometers is negligible for modern fighters, but crucial for the low-speed aircraft of World War I. The Camel's top speed was only 190 kilometers per hour, with a cruising speed of around 100 kilometers per hour, and a total range of only 485 kilometers. This meant pilots would have to spend an extra hour traveling to the target airspace or returning to the airport for refueling, significantly impacting fuel consumption, pilot fatigue, and sortie rates. Attendance rate refers to the fact that a team could normally make 4 round trips to engage in combat during a day, but due to the distance, they could only make 3 or even 2. Finally, Charles concluded, therefore, the best solution is to transport the supplies to Brussels, and I will transfer the fighters to Brussels Airport and use it as an operational base. Lieutenant General Avis, after hearing Charles's explanation, felt it made sense, but angrily asked, why didn't you say so earlier? We could have sent the supplies to Brussels from the beginning. Charles calmly replied, I'm very sorry, Lieutenant General, you didn't ask. I assumed you knew these basic air combat principles. The intelligence was quickly forwarded to Kitchener. Kitchener's eyes went black. That bastard, he must have done it on purpose. Lieutenant General Avis belonged to Haig's faction. They despised all new equipment, including aircraft, and of course, they were unaware of these air combat principles. Kitchener, the Minister of War, had never commanded air combat and was also completely ignorant. And Charles actually emphasized that this was basic, a truly malicious attack. But there was nothing he could do. The air regiment was in Charles's control, protests and objections were useless, and condemnations were even less effective. Kitchener had no choice but to send supplies to Brussels again, even more than he had sent to Namur, this time in 2 trainloads. However, this delay meant the entire day was gone. Then Charles gave them a basic lesson in air combat. Sorry, General, aircraft cannot operate at night. That day, the British forces near Antwerp fared poorly. Their lines were breached, and the entire army retreated in disarray. The Germans pursued them for over 10 kilometers, killing and wounding more than 10,000 British soldiers, capturing over 20,000, and seizing a large quantity of supplies stored within the lines. Ultimately, it was the fortified lines of Antwerp that saved these fleeing troops. The Germans hoped to follow the retreating British forces and advance into Antwerp, but Major General Eden decisively ordered his troops to open fire. Instantly, the fortified heavy artillery rained shells down on the demarcation line. The demarcation line was indistinct. British and German troops were intertwined, with enemies among themselves and each other among the enemy. However, the Belgian army did not hesitate for a moment, relentlessly pouring shells onto the front lines, creating bursts of fire and smoke. Soldiers were thrown into the air by the immense impact before crashing down, both British and German, like lifeless wooden figures, utterly defenseless, torn to pieces in mid-air. However, the limited number of fortified guns could not provide sufficient coverage, and although several German tanks were destroyed, they continued their high-speed charge towards the fortified lines. At the critical moment, the Saint-Mont self-propelled guns emerged from their forward positions, their dark muzzles aimed at the oncoming German tanks, making slight adjustments before unleashing a deafening roar. The German LK-1 tanks, with their frontal armor only 14 mm thick, could barely stop bullets, but against the 75mm guns, they were like paper, instantly riddled with bullets, some even emitting smoke and catching fire. Colonel Irwin remained with the troops, observing the battle from an F-4 armored vehicle and constantly directing the operation. The image above shows a German F-4 armored car from World War I, typically equipped with 4 machine guns, produced in 1915. Seeing this through his binoculars, he immediately ordered his staff, cease the attack, use Plan B. Yes, Colonel, the staff officer replied promptly. Colonel Irwin had been wary of the fortified lines trained and planned by Charles from the beginning, and seeing that the initial attack had failed, he immediately made a change. Chapter 602 The Real Crisis. Irwin carefully observed the fortified defenses and discovered they were a multi-layered defensive system. The fort's artillery guaranteed them an invincible position in artillery battles. The fort could easily destroy German artillery, while German artillery retaliating could only leave a white dot on the fort. If they deployed a Big Bertha as before, it would be easily destroyed by Charles's fighters. Therefore, it was a dead end unless the Germans could maintain absolute air superiority, which was impossible. On top of this, the fortified defenses included barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and then the Saint-Samont and fortified guns. It was practically impregnable. Therefore, Colonel Irwin decisively changed the attack plan, from a direct assault on Antwerp to penetration into the British heartland, encircling Antwerp while simultaneously advancing towards the Belgian stronghold of Ghent. Dunkirk, British Expeditionary Force Headquarters. Kitchener and his staff were in a frenzy, with telephones and telegrams ringing incessantly. With Haig in command of the Somme campaign and Lieutenant General Avis unable to control the situation in Antwerp, Secretary of State for War Kitchener was forced to oversee the overall command from the headquarters. A telegram arrived at Kitchener. Your Excellency, Antwerp has held off the German advance. Kitchener felt a wave of relief. This was rare good news. The staff officers in the command headquarters also breathed a sigh of relief, their tense movements slowing down, and several even cheered. Kitchener asked in a deep voice, who held them off? This was crucial, concerning the prestige of the British Army. The staff officer, somewhat embarrassed, lowered his voice considerably. It was the Belgian Army. Your Excellency, their fortified defenses have worked. The atmosphere in the command headquarters instantly became strange, somewhat oppressive, somewhat awkward, and somewhat embarrassing. The British Army had entered Belgium as victors, liberators, and protectors. When Lieutenant General Avis led his elite troops from Dunkirk, His slogan was to show the French what real war was, to teach Charles how to fight, and to show the Belgians which army was truly reliable. However, they not only failed to outmaneuver the French army, but they also failed to outmaneuver the Belgian army. In fact, they needed the Belgian army's protection. They were supposed to be protecting the Belgian army, but now they were barely surviving under their protection. Kitchener, forcing a calm, changed the subject, ordered Lieutenant General Avis to immediately organize the troops and prepare for a counter-offensive. Yes, Marshal, Kitchener never believed the British army was inferior to the Belgian army. He believed the British army's collapse was simply due to being caught off guard by the Germans. He believed that as long as the British army gained a foothold and launched an organized and planned counter-offensive, they would surely teach the Germans a harsh lesson. At that moment, another telegram arrived in Kitchener's presence. Your Excellency Field Marshal, the German army has bypassed Antwerp and is attacking our rear. What? Kitchener's face drained of color instantly. He looked up sharply at his staff officer and asked nervously, the route? What is their target? The staff officer studied the telegram for a while and pointed out a route on the map. The enemy is advancing westward along the road. Their target should be Ghent. Kitchener slumped into his chair, speechless for a long time. After a long while, he muttered, damn it. The Germans have learned charge tactics and are using them on us. The characteristic of trench warfare is an egg-shaped defense. The outer shell looks very hard, but once you pierce it, it's hollow inside. The British Army was no exception. At this time, although the British Expeditionary Force had nearly 1 million troops, most of them were concentrated in the Somme River. More than 300,000 men in Belgium had been badly defeated and could not be withdrawn in time, leaving them far behind the rapidly advancing German army. Note, the British Army deployed 54 divisions and over 1 million troops in the Somme region, suffering casualties of 420,000. Your Excellency Field Marshal, the staff officer said worriedly, looking at the map, once the Germans capture Ghent, it won't just be a matter of the Antwerp line collapsing. The entire country of Belgium will be cut off from supplies, and it could even threaten Ypres and Dunkirk. Ypres was also undefended, and Dunkirk had only 2 infantry regiments, less than 10,000 men. But these weren't the main issues. The crucial point was that if Ghent fell, the German Air Force, using Ghent airfield as a base, could blockade almost all of Belgium's roads and railways. Coupled with the German submarine blockade of sea routes, the entire Western Front would be without supplies. At that point, even if Char's air regiments were highly skilled, their aircraft superior, and their armored units formidable, they would face a situation where fuel dwindled with each battle, ultimately forcing them to withdraw from the battlefield. Only then did Kitchener understand the true danger and see the real crisis. After a moment of silence, Kitchener said weakly, we should ask Charles for help, but Your Excellency, the staff officer said doubtfully, we've already asked Charles for help. Kitchener slowly shook his head, not just his planes, we need his tanks, his troops, everything he has. Now, it's very likely only he can save us. The staff officer paused, then understood. I'll convey your meaning to Lieutenant General Elvis. Kitchener was a field marshal. For him to bow to Charles would be an insult to the dignity of the British Empire. Kitchener nodded slightly, his gaze fixed on the map, still struggling internally. He knew the price of asking Charles for help. The British army would be utterly crushed under Charles's feet, never again able to raise its head on Belgian and French soil, never again able to look any soldier, including the colonial troops, in the eye. Therefore, he still considered one possibility. Could the British army reverse this situation? A moment later, the staff officer returned. Your Excellency Marshal, Lieutenant General Avis has sent a telegram. He requests a chance to attack. He believes the main German force is advancing towards Ghent, leaving their rear vulnerable. If our cavalry launches a counter-offensive to cut off their supply lines, they will be unable to penetrate our territory, let alone reach Ghent. Kitchener laughed. Cavalry? He thinks cavalry can cut off German supply lines. This fool. Wasn't the lesson of the Somme sufficient? But then Kitchener thought that if Lieutenant General Avis wasn't given a chance, he and other commanders like Haig would always harbor illusions about cavalry, always believing their ineffectiveness was due to superiors' prohibition, thus ensuring cavalry would never be phased out. With this in mind, Kitchener nodded expressionlessly. Reply, do what you want. You are fully responsible. No need for my approval. Chapter 603 This is War. In the heart of Antwerp, at the headquarters of the British First Army, Lieutenant General Elvis paced anxiously. The distant roar of artillery fire intensified, and German fighter planes whizzed overhead, dominating the Antwerp skies and relentlessly searching for targets of interest. Lieutenant General Alves was the most unwilling to accept defeat and the least inclined to seek reinforcements from Charles. Since being transferred to the Antwerp defenses, he and his troops had lived in Charles's shadow. Although nominally the commander of Antwerp, he had never truly controlled the defenses. The French army, needless to say, and even the Belgian army and militia, obeyed only Charles. When Charles mobilized his forces to attack Namur, Lieutenant General Alves was completely unaware, only receiving intelligence after Namur had already captured the city. "We are the best," Lieutenant General Alves boasted to his men more than once. "The Charles's forces are nothing compared to us. We need a battle, and when that day comes, people will know our strength." Lieutenant General Alves was absolutely certain of this. The reason was simple: Britain was the world's leading power, and his first expeditionary army was Britain's most elite force, experienced, well-equipped, and highly trained. No one could compare to them, not even the Charles's troops. That day, the battle broke out unexpectedly. Although the initial battle was unfavorable, it was only because they were caught off guard and unprepared. That must be it. After a long pause, Lieutenant General Alves stopped and looked up to ask his staff, "How's the situation at the underground warehouse?" Reporting, "General," the staff officer replied, "German aircraft are providing cover for the storm assault team in waves. Major General Eden, several assaults have been repelled." Lieutenant General Alves frowned. "Tell Major General Eden that we need the supplies in the warehouse to launch a counter-offensive. Tell him to hurry." "Yes, General." A moment later, the staff officer rushed back, excitedly reporting, "General, Major General Eden has successfully recaptured the underground warehouse. The German fighters have also abandoned the blockade. We can obtain supplies from the underground warehouse." "Excellent." Lieutenant General Alves breathed a sigh of relief. This was a good start. "Send men to retrieve the supplies immediately," Lieutenant General Alves ordered. "Yes, General." What Lieutenant General Alves didn't know was that Major General Eden's success was due to his suggestion of a counter-offensive. Why stop the British if they were so eager to die? Besides, British ammunition wasn't compatible with the Belgian and French forces, keeping it was pointless. At 2 p.m., the British First Army entered the fortified lines, fully equipped and ready to advance. After some reorganization, the British troops looked much more spirited. Each soldier, helmeted and rifle-wielding, stood in neat formation in the trenches awaiting orders. Lieutenant General Alves and Major General Eden discussed and devised a counter-offensive plan. "I need your artillery to provide cover," Lieutenant General Alves said, pointing to the map, including the street. "Salmon tanks, but the street. Salmons can't hit anything," Major General Eden replied. Although the street Salmon tank was equipped with a 75mm gun with a range of 8 kilometers, its limited visibility due to its concealed hull meant that after a few shots, the hull would fill with toxic smoke, resulting in low accuracy in actual combat. It was better suited for defense or to accompany the advance to suppress enemy artillery deep within the enemy lines. "I don't need them to hit anything," Lieutenant General Alves replied. "All I need is for them to create some smoke on the battlefield." "Very well, General." Major General Eden nodded helplessly. "As you wish." Major General Eden looked at the attack diagram drawn by Lieutenant General Alves on the map and shook his head inwardly. This was a traditional offensive tactic: infantry breaking through from the front, cavalry flanking from both sides. Lieutenant General Alves hoped to break through the German lines before they could establish a firm foothold and cut them in half. This was suicidal. How could the Germans not be wary of cavalry? However, Major General Eden knew that saying anything would be useless, and he didn't want to say anything either. Let the battlefield teach these arrogant British a lesson. A piercing whistle blew, and British soldiers crawled out of the trenches, bayonets at the ready, charging towards the German lines. Shells flew back and forth, exploding continuously in the crowd. Groups of British soldiers were tossed into the air, some tumbling several times before crashing to the ground, some already dead, others convulsing in blood, still others screaming hoarsely from severed limbs. But no one helped them. Squads of soldiers passed by, rifles clutched tightly, eyes fixed on the German lines opposite. They knew that only by charging into the enemy trenches as quickly as possible could they avoid a helpless wait for death like their fallen comrades. The cavalry on both flanks launched their charge simultaneously, their speed increasing until they were galloping, leaving deep hoofprints and kicking up clouds of mud and snow. The riders on horseback crouched low, one hand gripping the reins, the other brandishing their sabers, the gleaming tips pointing forward, seemingly eager to cut through the oncoming wind and pierce the enemy's chest. However, German machine guns roared to life, bullets surging towards the British. Infantry fell in droves like felled wheat, neat rows strewn with blood. Cavalrymen were routed, horses bolting from their charge, riders thrown from their saddles to the snow, tumbling and rolling before coming to a stop, blood gushing from their ears, noses, and eyes, gasping for breath. Suddenly, the roar of airplanes filled the sky, fighter jets swooped down in the shadows of the sun, 2 volleys of bullets mercilessly striking the charging cavalry, creating a crimson spray. Horses neighed in terror, the cold wind howling mournfully. A frenzied massacre was unfolding in the no-man's land. But this was only the beginning. With a rumble of engines, the Germans, supported by dozens of tanks, launched a counterattack against the British. The tanks, also positioned on the flanks, charged at the oncoming cavalry at top speed. Like tigers among sheep, the British cavalry, unable to dodge, were trampled and crushed under the tracks, man and horse alike reduced to a bloody pulp. The British cavalry at the front halted their charge, but those behind surged forward, resulting in a gruesome scene of men and horses falling and bruised. Even Major General Eden couldn't bear to watch. He grabbed the phone and shouted to Lieutenant General Elvis, "You must stop. Immediately. This is pointless." But Lieutenant General Elvis refused without hesitation. His tone was cold, filled with confidence and pride. "No, Major General, this is war." Chapter 604 Clash of Old and New Ideas. Launching a counter-offensive with tanks was Irwin's attempt at a new tactic, derived from Charles's flexible defense. Unlike flexible defense, Irwin did not allow the British to break through his lines. Instead, he launched a counter-offensive directly based on the lines. This was based on the current German reality. The Germans had opened a gap of about 20 kilometers in their lines, a narrow passage that served as a supply line for their infiltrating forces. If the enemy were allowed in, this supply line would likely be cut off by the British. Therefore, Irwin believed he could not retreat an inch and had to completely contain the British within Antwerp. He also considered that this British infantry cavalry offensive might lead to hand-to-hand combat with the Germans in the trenches. This was Irwin's last hope, as the British and Belgian forces far outnumbered the Germans, and hand-to-hand combat would obviously be disadvantageous for the Germans. "Our advantages are aircraft and tanks," Colonel Irwin analyzed to Lieutenant General Nicholas. "I think we should make full use of this. Only in this way can we obtain the greatest benefit at the lowest cost." "But how can we defend with tanks?" Lieutenant General Nicholas countered. He understood aircraft defense. It could strafe charging enemies. But tank defense, placed behind the lines as artillery? What was the difference between that and a 77mm cannon? "Counterattack with tanks, General," Colonel Irwin replied. "The best defense is offense." As he spoke, Colonel Irwin's eyes flashed with murderous intent. He wanted to annihilate the enemy's mobile forces before they could react, or at least cripple them, to ensure the safety of the German supply lines. Initially, Colonel Irwin wasn't entirely confident. Because cavalry were highly mobile and had excellent awareness, they could quickly withdraw once they realized an attack was pointless. However, when Colonel Irwin saw the British cavalry colliding with tanks without retreating, still searching for openings to charge, he knew his objective had been perfectly achieved. "These fools," Colonel Irwin said, putting away his binoculars, his eyes filled with disdain. "Do they think their flesh and blood can outrun tanks?" Namur Castle, 1st Mechanized Division Command Post. Charles received a battle report from Antwerp, sent by Major General Eden. "Foolish British." They ordered their cavalry to charge enemy tanks. Their proud cavalry division was wiped out in less than half an hour, with over 7,000 soldiers killed or wounded. "This is no battle, General. You should prepare for the next step." Tidjany was unsurprised when he saw the telegram. "This is what you call survival of the fittest, Lieutenant General," he said. "This is not just a battle between the British and German armies, but a clash between old and new ideas, just as emerging capitalists use machines to eliminate traditional aristocrats." Charles nodded in agreement. This wasn't just a World War I event. Even in World War II, there were still instances of cavalry charging tanks. It seemed foolish. Logically, no one with a sound mind would do such a thing. However, humans are always accustomed to following tradition and habit, so the process of elimination is much longer than imagined. Dunkirk, British Expeditionary Force Headquarters. Kitchener sat quietly at his desk, waiting for news. He felt that anything he did now was superfluous, because he had no troops left to deploy. Ironically, the British army outnumbered the Germans by a significant margin, and the Belgian army was twice the size of the Germans, yet they were driven to the brink of defeat with no troops available to redeploy. At that moment, an urgent telegram arrived hastily from the staff: "My cavalry division has suffered over half its casualties, and the infantry has lost over 7,000 men. We still haven't broken through the German lines." Kitchener grunted in agreement. This was entirely within his expectations. "Now," the staff officer said anxiously, "should we have Lieutenant General Avis contact Charles?" "No." Kitchener shook his head, his voice soft. "I'll do it." At this point, having Lieutenant General Avis contact Charles and ask for his help was worse than death. Fortunately, the telephone line from Dunkirk to Namur was still operational, and Kitchener successfully spoke with Charles. "I believe you've already seen the crisis, General," Kitchener said calmly, as if discussing something unrelated to Britain. "Once the Germans capture Ghent, it won't just be the Antwerp line that's facing supply difficulties, but the entirety of France." Kitchener used France instead of Western Front. The subtext was, "You're the one in a hurry, General. If you don't intervene, France will be destroyed, and Britain will at most retreat to its home island." This was taking advantage of someone else's position. Clearly the British had caused the trouble, yet now that the situation was out of control and they needed Charles's help, they still acted arrogantly. "I understand, Marshal." Charles feigned helplessness. "I have no choice but to save them, don't I?" "Of course," Kitchener replied, a hint of smugness in his voice. "Because you're a smart man, you won't do anything foolish." Everything was still the same, Kitchener thought. He could still use the resources at his disposal to control France. "Aren't you worried that I can't save them, or that it won't be in time?" Charles countered. "Of course not," Kitchener laughed. "In this respect, I've always had great confidence in you." This was the truth. Charles's military genius was unmatched. Only stubborn fools like Haig and Elvis would think Charles had succeeded by luck. "All right," Charles replied, "you win, Your Excellency. The rest is up to me." But Charles added meaningfully, "The quartermaster sends his regards." Then he hung up. Kitchener was taken aback. The quartermaster sends his regards. What did that mean? Then it dawned on him. The quartermaster was the former First Lord of the Admiralty. It was said he and Charles had reached an agreement to some extent. Could it be true? Kitchener sensed something was terribly wrong. Charles's retaliation might not only be against the German army, but also against British control of supplies. But what could Charles do? The quartermaster was also British. He would inevitably side with Britain in this matter. Kitchener slowly hung up the phone, his brow furrowed, staring blankly into the distance. He couldn't understand how Charles could break this deadlock. Suddenly, a staff officer shouted excitedly, yelling to Kitchener from a dozen meters away, "Your Excellency, the Royal Navy has achieved a great victory. We sank 12 German submarines in one fell swoop." 12. Kitchener was stunned. "Are you sure?" In one fell swoop, this was almost impossible. Such efficiency had never been achieved in anti-submarine warfare before, by any other nation. "Yes, I'm sure." The staff officer rushed forward and handed the telegram to Kitchener. "This is because the French Navy participated, equipped with Charles's newly invented anti-submarine equipment." Kitchener was astonished. He knew the source of Charles's confidence, and he knew that Britain would lose absolute control over its supplies. Chapter 605 Perfect Deterrence. Wishing everyone a happy and healthy new year, and all the best. London, England, Regent Street bustling with people. A heavy snowfall blanketed the world, concealing even the grime of the alleyways. Cars ply the streets, and gentlemen in top hats and suits hurry along the sidewalks, seemingly contemplating how to procure supplies from America or how to secure more loans from banks. Newsboys, dressed in worn-out, thin coats and caps, their bags crammed with newspapers almost as thick as themselves, panting as they chased after pedestrians, shouting, "Sir, a newspaper, please, big news. News of victory, the Royal Navy has sunk 12 German submarines in one battle." Hearing these shouts, pedestrians stopped, glanced at the newsboys with a hint of disbelief, then pulled a penny from their pockets, exchanging it for a newspaper like a beggar. The image above shows a newsboy selling newspapers on a British street. A passerby eagerly flipped through the newspaper, walking slowly, then exclaimed, "My God, it's true. They sank 12 submarines." Other passersby bought newspapers and soon joined the discussion. "Great news. And 12 in one battle. That means they've found a way to deal with submarines. Does that mean we won't lack supplies anymore? But gentlemen, did you see what the newspaper said? It was with the cooperation of the French Navy, but this was quickly met with opposition. The French Navy? They're just cooperating, their role is extremely limited. The Royal Navy is the strongest navy in the world, they outnumber all other navies combined. The French Navy's involvement is probably just a matter of the sea area, they're more familiar with the nearby shipping lanes and sea conditions. The passers-by smiled proudly, completely disregarding the mention of the French Navy in the newspaper. This was actually a deliberate misrepresentation by the media. During wartime, they always tried to exaggerate their own victories, completely omitting any mention of the British Army's crushing defeat at the Antwerp defences yesterday. Mr. Stokes, cane in hand, flipped through the newspaper, glanced at it, and scoffed. So that's what the newspapers wrote. These foolish and ignorant fellows. Someone heard Stokes's words and glared at him. You seem to have a different opinion. Stokes shook his head slightly, waving the newspaper in his hand. I don't want to argue with you, gentlemen. I just want to say that if you only look at this, you will miss many opportunities to make a fortune. With that, Stokes ignored them, disdainfully tossing the newspaper into the air, and left without looking back. Stokes's company had collaborated with Charles, and recently, it had become part of the Bernard Group, responsible for the development of tank guns. It wasn't surprising that he knew some inside information. But the others didn't know this. They laughed and mocked Stokes's ignorance and arrogance, then went on to discuss the greatness of the Royal Navy. Just then, someone came running up breathlessly. Gentlemen, Bernard Company's stock price has soared, people exclaimed in surprise. Bernard Company? Charles is Bernard Company, the Royal Navy won. Why is Charles's company's stock price soaring? Charles's company is in the insurance industry, what does this have to do with him? Then someone else ran up and shouted, Bernard Company has launched a new business, they've started insuring shipping. People were stunned. Only then did they realize that the victory of sinking 12 submarines was likely related to the French fleet, or more precisely, to Charles. At Namur Castle, Charles was having breakfast. Since the 6th Army's supplies were transferred to the British Army, Charles's rations had also deteriorated considerably. Breakfast consisted only of mashed potatoes and a piece of Belgian Limburg cheese. The latter smelled incredibly foul, and Charles couldn't swallow it. Fortunately, his orderly, Adrian, didn't object. The image above shows Limburg cheese from Belgium, made through bacterial fermentation. While eating, a telegram arrived from Joka. Progress in the new British territory is going smoothly. Charles smiled slightly. This was a powerful rebuttal to the British capitalists who were desperately trying to destroy the Bernard Group. The echo detector was a lucrative business opportunity. In this war where resources were king, it held the Allied powers' lifeline in its hands. Not just Britain, but also France, and even other member states. Not just political and military, but also a precise economic strike. From now on, whoever wanted supplies would have to buy Charles's insurance. With insurance, they could join Charles's escort convoys, otherwise, they'd be waiting for German submarines to come knocking. The Germans weren't stupid. After this battle, they would surely guess what equipment Charles had invented that allowed the French Navy to precisely destroy submarines. Therefore, German submarines would try to avoid Charles's escort convoys and choose to attack non-Charles ships. Thus, a perfect deterrent was formed. Those who submit to me prosper, those who oppose me perish. It must be said that the Germans were truly effective. Otherwise, with so many industries and so many competitors among the British and French capitalists, Charles alone simply couldn't handle them. Tigeny didn't care about business, that was his father's concern. He frowned as he ate his mashed potatoes and asked, So, we're preparing to counterattack Antwerp. Counterattack Antwerp, Charles replied. Who told you that? Tigeny looked up in confusion. Isn't it? Our supplies have been transported to Brussels, some fighter planes have gone, and we've also transferred a corps from the 6th Army. Attacking Antwerp was the best option, Tigeny thought. Our army could coordinate with Antwerp to create a pincer movement against the Germans. The Germans were prepared in Antwerp, General, Charles replied. You should know that the Germans have prepared at least 500 aircraft there, while we can only muster 200 in this direction, but our aircraft are more advanced than theirs, Tigeny replied. The outcome is still uncertain, I agree, Charles nodded. But we will pay a heavy price, especially for our pilots. Although the Camel had a speed advantage, it didn't have an overwhelming advantage compared to the German Fokker E-2. especially since the Germans could directly attack the airfields or use guerrilla tactics to deplete the French fuel. Furthermore, the Germans had a corps stationed in the Brussels direction, with fortifications built in preparation for Charles's army. But that's war, Tigny emphasized. Antwerp is a place we must save, is that so? Charles countered, looking up quietly at Tigny. You seem to have forgotten our well-prepared battle plan. Tigny paused, then his eyes lit up. You mean, Hasselt? Chapter 606. This is another Schlieffen plan. Kitchener and Lieutenant General Avis believed that Charles would launch a counter-offensive from Brussels, and they were prepared to coordinate with Charles to attack the German forces from both sides. King Albert I, Major General Eden, and Foch also believed that Charles would launch an attack from Brussels. King Albert I arrived in Brussels first, personally directing the militia to gather intelligence on the German forces and to investigate the firepower and troop deployment of the German lines. Major General Eden, in addition to holding Antwerp, was responsible for organizing partisans to harass and disrupt the German supply lines. Foch commanded the French forces in the Somme and Verdun to launch a counter-offensive against the Germans, increasing the pressure on them and preventing them from reinforcing Belgium. The Germans also believed that Charles would launch a counter-offensive from Brussels. Colonel Irwin was busy near the breach in the defensive line, trying to connect the new German defensive line with Leuven. Lieutenant General Nicholas wasn't very confident about the infiltration. He reminded Irwin, "We're facing Charles's forces. No one dares to risk anything against them, Colonel. We're no match for Charles in either tanks or aircraft." "I know, General," Colonel Irwin insisted. "But we still have hope of victory because of supplies. Charles's forces are lacking supplies. How do you plan to deal with Charles's fighters?" Lieutenant General Nicholas interrupted Irwin. The Camel was 50 km per hour faster than the Fokker E-2, forcing the German Air Force to avoid combat for a time, as fighting almost certainly meant certain death. "The best defense is a good offense, General," Colonel Irwin replied, pointing to the map. "Brussels has only one airfield, and our aircraft have a numerical advantage. They can be deployed in several waves around the enemy airfield for successive attacks." Lieutenant General Nicholas seemed to understand Colonel Irwin's meaning. "You mean, attack the enemy airfield?" Colonel Irwin nodded. "Yes, General. Our Air Force will try to avoid air combat with the enemy. I plan to adopt guerrilla warfare, mainly to deplete the enemy's fuel. The enemy planes will eventually land. At that time, our forces will attack the enemy airfield simultaneously from several directions, destroying the aircraft parked there." Lieutenant General Nicholas nodded thoughtfully. "If they couldn't be shot down in the air, they would be destroyed while their planes were parked." After a moment's hesitation, Lieutenant General Nicholas asked again, "What about the tanks?" "Our tanks are no match for the Char A-1 either," Irwin answered decisively. "Anti-tank ditches, but they have bridging vehicles, Colonel," Lieutenant General Nicholas reminded him. "Have you forgotten the Battle of Namur?" "Of course I haven't forgotten, General," Colonel Irwin replied. "But I hid my 77mm guns in underground bunkers at the front of the position, waiting to push the bridging vehicles out and destroy them. In addition, I've erected multiple layers of barbed wire and laid mines in front of the anti-tank ditches, and 105mm guns are marking the area behind the anti-tank ditches." Lieutenant General Nicholas thought it sounded promising. It seemed capable of holding off the Char's bridging vehicles. "The important thing," Irwin concluded, "is that the Char's troops have limited supplies. If we hold out for a few days, the Char's troops will be completely incapacitated." Lieutenant General Nicholas nodded in satisfaction. He felt this might be the Char's first defeat since joining the army. This wasn't a problem with the quality of the French 1st Panzer Corps, nor with their equipment, nor even with Charles's command. Rather, it was the foolish decision of the British and the French Parliament to cut Charles's supplies. Now, even if supplies were delivered to Charles day and night, it wouldn't be enough. The supplies that could be delivered were far less than what had been consumed since the start of the battle. This was precisely Charles's fatal weakness. Nicholas thought it over, and he patted Irwin on the shoulder with satisfaction, sincerely exclaiming, "You should be the commander, Colonel. Well done." In the Prime Minister's office in Paris, upon learning that the main German force had rapidly advanced towards Ghent and threatened the French supply lines, Brian and Clemenceau were terrified. "God, this is another Schlieffen plan," Clemenceau swallowed hard, staring at the map. "Just like last time, the Germans are launching a surprise attack from the north. If this continues, Paris could be in danger again." "Really?" Brian looked up at Clemenceau, his eyes filled with fear. A lawyer by training, He knew nothing about military matters. But the Germans are still in Belgium. They seem quite far away. Although Clemenceau had never served in the military, he was a doctor who had served as a medic in the Franco-German War. He had more military experience than Brian, and now he acted as an expert, analyzing the situation for him. Things are different now, Your Excellency. When the war first broke out, France had plenty of supplies. At that time, our army didn't rely on external aid, and even if the Germans reached Paris, we were able to fight back. But now, we are facing a severe shortage of supplies. 40% of our ammunition comes from the United States, transported by sea. The Germans can cut off our supply lines by advancing along the coastline. This is fatal. Brian's face turned pale. He hadn't expected things to be so serious. He only wanted to weaken the Charles, but he never expected it would plunge the entire country of France into danger. If France collapsed in this battle, he would undoubtedly lose his position as prime minister, and it would even become a major stain on his record, making it impossible for him to achieve anything in politics in the future. Thinking of this, Brian stood up nervously. We should send supplies to the Charles immediately, concentrate all resources and transportation capacity, even if it means drawing supplies from the Somme or Verdun. It's too late, Your Excellency. Clemenceau shook his head. The battle is about to begin, and German fighter planes have already begun to blockade the railways and roads. After a pause, Clemenceau added, simply put, we have supplies in the rear but no Charles, and we have Charles on the front lines but no supplies. Brian slumped back into his chair and sighed deeply. He regretted it. He shouldn't have joked about the war at this time. He thought the Allied powers had victory in their grasp, so he began to weaken the Charles before achieving a decisive victory. After a long silence, Brian asked weakly, Charles, can he win? He doesn't really believe Charles can win under these circumstances, unless a miracle occurs. Suddenly, the secretary rushed in with a telegram. Your Excellency, Charles's troops have launched an attack. He's attacking Hasselt. Hasselt. Brian and Clemenceau exchanged bewildered glances. They had absolutely no idea what that place was. What was that? Why would Charles attack there? Should he be attacking Antwerp? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 607 Infiltration Warfare. Outside Namur, a German defensive line stood amidst a snowstorm. This line was originally defended by Lieutenant General Nicholas's 21st Corps, tasked with halting the breakthroughs in pursuit of the Belgian Army and the 1st Charlemagne Panzer Corps. However, this elite unit was transferred to Antwerp for the offensive, and the garrison was replaced by the 37th Corps, which had just completed its reorganization in Berlin. This reorganization meant that the troops, already severely weakened at the front, were moved to the rear to rest while being replenished with a large number of new recruits who underwent minimal training before being redeployed to the front lines. Sending new recruits directly to the front was not the German practice. Normally, they would assign them to reserve units, assigning them low-intensity combat missions to acclimatize them before deploying them to the front. But with the fighting raging on multiple fronts and manpower shortages, they couldn't afford such precautions. Colonel Ralph stamped his foot in the trench, shivered nervously for a moment, and then cautiously peeked out from behind the ramparts to observe the Belgian defensive line opposite. Nothing. It was too quiet. A vast expanse of white obscured even the corpses and blood. As Colonel Ralph turned back, Staff Officer Peter approached and asked, "What are you worried about, Colonel?" "The Belgian attack." Ralph didn't answer. Nearby German soldiers responded confidently, "Don't worry, Colonel. Although our troops have many new recruits, we're more than capable of dealing with the Belgians." "Yes, Colonel, we know the Belgians. They bought their rifles and artillery from us. They won't defeat us. If we lack combat experience, the Belgians are about the same." Colonel Ralph replied grimly, "You seem to have forgotten that besides the Belgian army, Namur also has Charles's troops, the 1st Panzer Corps." These words instantly silenced everyone. A cold wind seemed to sweep through the trenches, extinguishing the soldiers' newly ignited fighting spirit. After a long silence, Peter finally replied, "But Colonel, Charles's 1st Panzer Corps is about to be transferred to Brussels." The soldiers chimed in, "Yes, everyone knows the 1st Panzer Corps is going to attack Antwerp. Our troops are fighting the British like monkeys, Charles has to go rescue them. No, it should be for resupply. Coastal cities are important supply points for the Allies. Charles has to go. Colonel Ralph didn't answer. The soldiers made sense, but he still felt something was off. If, as they said, Charles had to rescue Antwerp, then Charles's tanks should have been transported to Brussels long ago. But Colonel Ralph hadn't heard any intelligence about this. In other words, Charles's troops were likely still in Namur, and his target might not necessarily be Antwerp. Suddenly, Colonel Ralph's expression changed, and he ordered, "Shut up. Be quiet." The soldiers all fell silent, even those wiping their rifles stopped what they were doing, and everyone turned their questioning gazes to Colonel Ralph. "Listen carefully," Colonel Ralph whispered, then asked, "Did you hear anything?" The soldiers strained to listen, some even removing the earmuffs and hoods they had been covering. Peter stood up and peeked out slightly. Colonel Ralph was right, there seemed to be something different in the biting wind. Like a whimper, like a wolf howl, or perhaps, no. It was the roar of an engine. "Tanks," Peter exclaimed, turning to look at the soldiers. Shock and fear instantly filled everyone's eyes, including Colonel Ralph's. The Belgian army didn't have tanks. The tanks meant Charles's troops, the 1st Panzer Corps, which was attacking them. "This can't be," someone shouted, his voice trembling. He clearly sensed something was wrong but refused to face reality. The sound grew louder, and the rattling of tracks hitting the ice and snow could even be heard. Colonel Ralph swiftly crouched at the edge of the trench, raising his binoculars. Rows of dark tanks relentlessly tore through the snow, filling the binoculars' field of vision, a dense, overwhelming array. Though blurry, they were undoubtedly Charles A1s, and armored bridge-laying vehicles were also faintly visible. "Alarm!" Colonel Ralph shouted back, "Prepare for battle." Before he could finish, a bullet whizzed through the air, striking Colonel Ralph precisely in the head. It left a trail of blood on the rear wall of the trench, freezing his life in that instant. His body fell straight to the ground like a stake. The soldiers instantly panicked, shouting as they rushed out of the trench, setting up their rifles along the edge. The machine gunner followed. However, before they could even comprehend what was happening, bullets seemed to have eyes, felling them to the ground in pools of blood. The German recruits who had followed were terrified by the scene. They gasped for breath, staring blankly at everything. This seemed unlike any battlefield they knew. The veterans had told the recruits more than once, "The enemy will fire artillery before each attack, that's called artillery cover, then the enemy will launch their attack. All you have to do is raise your guns, aim, and pull the trigger. Don't worry, there's no danger in defensive battles. Just follow the veterans." Think about the Battle of the Somme. We killed 100,000 British in a single day. Defensive battles have geographical advantages. However, the recruits watched helplessly as the veterans who peeked out were shot back one by one, almost all dying before their eyes, their brains splattered from bullets in the head. No artillery preparation, not even a glimpse of the enemy, only the sound of gunfire, and with such precision. What was happening? Could they still peek out? Would they suffer the same fate as the veterans? Some daring recruits did peek out, and indeed, they suffered the same fate as the veterans. Their brains splattered and they died instantly. Machine gunners fired haphazardly, and were immediately taken down by a few bullets. The new recruits, terrified, crouched in the trenches clutching their rifles, screaming and helpless. Some tried to recall what their instructors had taught them, but their minds went blank. No one had ever mentioned this situation. Sheatter employed stealth tactics. Snowy days provided the best cover. Soldiers tied white cloths to their rifles, donned white cloaks, and crawled under the cover of darkness to within 100 meters, 50 meters, or even closer to the enemy. After lying still for half an hour or an hour, the snow would conceal all traces. At dawn, thousands of soldiers would lie in ambush in front of the enemy trenches, their gun barrels pointed at the enemy in the darkness, completely unaware of their presence. Note, this is a common tactic used by our army. Designed to engage the enemy in close combat and hand-to-hand fighting even without superior firepower. Martyr Chu Shaoyan heroically sacrificed his life during this infiltration, ensuring he remained undetected and didn't disrupt the battle plan. Chapter 608 The Benefits of the Belgian Army. Unlike the Chinese People's Volunteer Army's use of stealth warfare, Char's objective in this battle was to conserve time, ammunition, and fuel. Although Char had secretly stockpiled a batch of ammunition, it was still an infiltration operation, and no one could be certain how much ammunition and fuel would be needed to hold Hasselt. This was a battle of attrition, where saving resources was paramount in the early stages. The Germans had never experienced such a reckless fighting style. They couldn't imagine anyone able to remain hidden for so long in the heavy snow, especially with over 3,000 men. It sounded simple, but it was incredibly difficult. Over 3,000 men lying in wait motionless in the freezing cold for more than 3 hours. If even one person faltered or made a small movement, they could be exposed. Without exceptional organization and discipline, it was impossible, and extremely dangerous. But for the 1st Panzer Corps, this was just routine training. Especially for Tigony's mechanized division, Char's requirement for this unit was that it could fight any battle, while the infantry of the armored division was much simpler, combined arms warfare. The battle unfolded as Char had anticipated. The soldiers' successful infiltration to the designated time meant they were already halfway there. The tanks were deployed primarily to draw enemy attention and artillery fire. German artillery, adhering to their traditional practice, assumed the French offensive line was behind the tanks and immediately opened fire on the tank formation. The roar of artillery fire filled the air as volleys of shells hurtled towards the tanks miles away. However, bombarding the tank formation was largely ineffective. The tanks were mobile and armored, posing little threat without a direct hit. This noise and chaos, in turn, provided cover for the ambush. As soon as the German artillery opened fire, the ambushed troops launched their attack. They crawled out of their positions, and under the cover of friendly forces, crossed barbed wire and anti-tank ditches, hurling grenades into the enemy trenches in droves. A cloud of smoke and explosions followed, and finally, submachine gunners and shotgunners charged into the trenches, unleashing a massacre. The German artillery fire soon ceased. It wasn't that they wanted to stop, but the German artillery, firing in the middle of the battle, suddenly looked up and were shocked to find their own troops retreating in droves. Looking closer, they saw groups of French soldiers, brandishing bayonets, menacingly advancing towards the artillery positions. What was happening? The enemy was still miles away. Why were they right in front of them? There was no time to think. They turned and abandoned their artillery, fleeing with the infantry. Infantry and trenches couldn't stop the enemy. Their artillery was even less likely to. Charles's 1st Panzer Corps had achieved a resounding victory. The French pursued the Germans relentlessly, advancing over 20 kilometers into German territory in a single day, killing and wounding over 20,000 and capturing over 7,000. Charles didn't bother to count the exact numbers, because it wasn't important, at least not for the poorly supplied 1st Panzer Corps. What mattered was the supplies. Due to the rapid retreat of the German 37th Corps, food, ammunition, and equipment hadn't been destroyed, and were handed over to Charles almost intact. Including rifles seized from the battlefield, prisoners, and warehouses, Charles captured over 40,000 rifles in one fell swoop, along with a large number of Maxim machine guns, anti-tank rifles, hundreds of 77mm infantry guns, and over 3,100 5mm howitzers, as well as a large quantity of food, ammunition, and shells. Tigony's eyes blazed at the mountain of ammunition. It's a pity this ammunition doesn't match our rifles, but it's the same as the Belgian armies, Charles said. The Belgian military's rifles are Mauser-based, and most of the artillery is also from Germany. Tigony instantly understood Charles's meaning. You mean, let the Belgian 1st Special Reconnaissance Corps accompany us on our infiltration? Do we have any other choice? Charles countered. The French might be able to send a contingent from Jean Blaux, but the more French troops there were, the greater the consumption of Lebel rifle ammunition. If the Belgian army, equipped with German weaponry, followed, the captured equipment and ammunition could be put to good use. The Belgian force of over 60,000 men would hardly need to worry about ammunition and equipment, and their equipment would improve as the fighting progressed, making them even stronger. Tigony seemed to have considered these benefits as well, nodding excitedly in agreement. This will alleviate the logistical pressure on our army. I didn't expect the Belgian army to have this advantage. Then he hesitated and asked, however, the Belgian Special Reconnaissance Army doesn't seem to have a unified command. This unit had always been led by Major General Eden, who was currently organizing the defense in Antwerp. Charles answered decisively, or rather, ordered, call back Albert I and let him command. Tigony was taken aback. That was the king, a lieutenant general. Couldn't you be a little more polite? However, Albert I seemed to have no reason to refuse. He would even be grateful. After all, this was about leading his troops to reclaim territory, and incidentally gaining experience alongside Charles's troops. With such a powerful older brother leading the way, How could he refuse? In Brussels, Albert I was busy gathering intelligence in the temporary command headquarters of the city government. The reasons he was in a hurry to rush to Brussels to take command were twofold. First, he anticipated that Charles would use this as a base to launch a counterattack. Second, Brussels was the capital of Belgium. After the German army broke through the Antwerp-Brussels defenses, its troops stationed in Leuven and its infiltrating forces formed a semi-encirclement of Brussels. He could disregard the situation of the Allied powers, but Brussels, the capital of Belgium, could not fall into German hands again. Otherwise, it would severely damage the morale and confidence of the Belgian military and civilians. Therefore, upon arriving in Brussels, he actively organized the militia to gather intelligence on the German army, while simultaneously making every effort to ensure logistical support, such as procuring fuel for Charles's aircraft and tanks, and preparing food and ammunition for the troops. We cannot allow Charles's troops to be bogged down because of these factors, Albert I told the mayor of Brussels. Otherwise, we will be the sinners of Belgium, forever branded with shame. Yes, Your Majesty. Mayor de Blauw was somewhat nervous. The king's words were very serious. Elevating the matter to the level of the nation and the people, this matter could not be taken lightly. However, just as Albert I was overwhelmed with the work, a communications soldier excitedly reported to him with a telegram, Your Majesty, Charles's troops have broken through the German lines and are penetrating deep into enemy territory. He needs your command of the 1st Special Reconnaissance Corps. Albert I was stunned. Charles won a battle? Where? Albert I's first thought was somewhere in Brussels, but he had no idea that Charles's troops were there. Namur, Your Majesty, the communications soldier replied. Charles has broken through the German Namur line and is advancing towards Hasselt. Namur, Albert I exclaimed in surprise, advancing towards Hasselt. Chapter 609 The King's Command. Charles's command post was set up on an armored reconnaissance vehicle, exposed to the elements without a tarpaulin. Snowflakes fell continuously from the top, and the biting wind howled, making everyone shiver. But Charles knew it was necessary. Covering the vehicle with tarpaulin to shield it from the wind and snow seemed convenient, but if the armored reconnaissance vehicle was attacked and caught fire, or if an emergency occurred, it would greatly hinder escape and counterattack. On the battlefield, nothing is more important than safety, everything else must give way to safety. Charles was eating his lunch, a piece of black bread captured from the Germans, frozen like a stone, requiring him to hold it in his mouth for a while before he could bite it. Tigeny handed Charles a telegram, his face making no attempt to hide his excitement and pride. The Germans have sent us another batch of supplies, filling more than 20 trucks. Charles took the telegram and read that the tank unit leading the way had collided head-on with a German supply convoy. After firing only a few shots, the Germans surrendered, and the supplies, along with the trucks, were captured by the French, without missing a single one. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it was happening in various directions. The 1st Panzer Army, which had previously been short of supplies, suddenly became well off, at least in terms of food. I heard that Hasselt is a distribution center for German supplies, Charles asked. Yes, Tigeny nodded. The German railway lines go directly to Hasselt, where they've built many underground warehouses to store supplies. This was a decision Charles made after he gained air superiority and continuously attacked German supply lines. The Germans dared not extend their railway lines directly to Leuven or any closer to the front lines, otherwise the railway and trains would be bombed to scrap metal. They could only transport supplies to Hasselt, and then distribute them to various parts of the front lines by truck under cover of darkness, thus avoiding air raids. Very good. Charles looked at Hasselt on the map and order the troops to prepare for an all-night march. They must reach Hasselt before dawn tomorrow. Yes, General, Tigeny replied, relaying the order. He knew the importance of speed in warfare. The sooner he arrived, the fewer enemy reinforcements there would be, the less prepared Hasselt would be, and the greater the chance of a swift victory. Just then, a car pulled up behind them, honking its horn a few times as it caught up with Charles's reconnaissance vehicle. Charles and Tigeny looked at the car with suspicion, only to see Albert I lean out and wave excitedly at Charles. Hey, General, it's me. I just got off the plane and came straight here. Charles and Tigeny exchanged glances, both seeing surprise and fear in each other's eyes. Albert I had made at least 3 fatal mistakes. First, driving in an unarmored and highly conspicuous car on the battlefield meant that if German soldiers were lying in ambush, they would immediately recognize the person inside. Second, His waving and shouting general at Charles could have put Charles and his command post in danger if German snipers or small squads were lying in ambush nearby. Thirdly, he wore an extremely extravagant military uniform, a top-crowned military cap with gold trim, a wide stand-up collar adorned with conspicuous leaves, yellow ribbons draped over his shoulders, and a metal pin to his chest, making him look like a president from the Republic of China era. This attire would pose a danger to him and those around him wherever he went. The image above shows Albert I in military uniform. Tigny cautiously peeked out and looked around, then turned to Charles, his tone a mixture of relief and disdain. "You think he's suitable to command the Belgian army?" Charles sighed, ordering the reconnaissance vehicle to stop. As Albert I got in, he replied softly, "Yes, Major General, no one is more suitable than him." Tigny thought Charles was being sarcastic and wanted to retort, but seeing Albert I approaching, he said nothing more, only pursing his lips dismissively. He believed this king was better suited to staying in the rear to stabilize the situation. The battlefield was not his place. "My dear friend," Albert I embraced Charles immediately upon boarding the vehicle, then patted Tigny on the shoulder, and turned to grasp Charles's hand tightly, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I knew you would lead us to defeat the Germans, General. I never doubted it, and neither did my soldiers, Your Majesty." Charles casually removed his helmet and handed it to him. "If you want us to defeat the Germans, you must wear this." Albert I paused, then realized his mistake, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "Of course, General, I apologize for the embarrassment. But I shouldn't use your helmet." "I can." He suddenly remembered that the Belgian army was not yet equipped with helmets. "Here you go." Charles handed over the helmet. "My helmet is the same as everyone else's. My orderly will get me another one." Charles actually wanted Albert I to change out of his gold-trimmed top hat as soon as possible. It was particularly noticeable in the semi-open armored vehicle. "All right." Albert I finally listened to Charles and put it on. But that wasn't all. Charles dismissed the limousine following behind, then had Albert I remove his medals, cut off his epaulets and ribbons, and finally clothe him in a white cloak. Albert I was clever enough to know why this was happening and therefore didn't object from beginning to end. "What can we do, General?" Albert I asked. "You probably already know where our objective is," Charles replied. "Of course." Albert I pointed to a point on the unfolded map and said, "Hasselt." It wasn't hard to guess. It could be deduced from the direction of Charles's troops' advance. "First," Charles replied, "I need your troops to construct a supply line from Namur to Hasselt." "Understood." Albert I nodded readily. He knew what constructing a supply line meant. A supply line was different from a defensive line. A defensive line involved constructing trenches and barbed wire, guarding every point without any gaps. The supply lines involved capturing and holding villages and towns along the way, providing cover and protection for supply convoys. Charles had done this during the attack on Antwerp, and Albert I had long since thoroughly studied these tactics. Secondly, Charles continued, "I hope you can send a militia detachment to infiltrate Hasselt and lead the people of Hasselt to cooperate with our attack." "No problem." Albert I nodded confidently. This was something he often did. Tigny suddenly understood. He glanced at Charles and then turned his gaze to Albert I. The king was indeed the suitable commander, Tigny thought. Because the Belgians along the way would all believe that the king was leading a large army to liberate them alongside Charles. Chapter 610 The Power of the Masses. Charles was leveraging Albert I's appeal, or rather, the power of the masses. This was based on two considerations. First, the supplies captured from the German army included a large number of German rifles. Over 40,000 had already been captured during the initial breakthrough of German lines. Captured German supply convoys along the way and subsequent occupation of warehouses would likely result in even more weapons and ammunition. The French army had no use for these weapons, and while the Belgian 1st Special Reconnaissance Corps might have ammunition, they wouldn't need rifles, and they had an abundance of bullets. So why not arm the civilian population along the route? 40,000 rifles could arm 40,000 militiamen, regardless of gender, as long as they were taught how to fire. Second, the quality of the German troops hadn't been great by this point in the war. Especially since elite units had been deployed to Antwerp for the main offensive, the troops remaining in the rear and deep inland were mostly new recruits. These new recruits were not much less skilled than the Belgian militia, who, with their defense of their homeland courage, might be even more capable than the German recruits, and their ultimate contribution might be far greater than anticipated. Indeed, things unfolded as Charles had predicted. Upon learning of his mission, Albert I immediately organized troops to follow the French army, establishing supply lines along the route. He also distributed surplus rifles to civilians in villages and towns along the way to organize militias. More importantly, he organized a cavalry force to take a shortcut ahead of the main force, relaying messages to towns leading to Hasselt so that people could prepare to meet Charles's army. One reason for the slow advance of the 1st Panzer Corps was the snow accumulation on the roads. Days of heavy snow had covered the roads with a thick layer, making it common for vehicle wheels to get stuck and slip, often falling into another pothole shortly after being pushed out. Despite being called an armored or mechanized force, they were barely faster than people on foot. Track tanks might have fared better, but the low chassis of the Charles A1 meant that the steel plates at the front were like bulldozing, pushing through the snow, which kept piling up, requiring soldiers to constantly clear it. By 2 p.m., these problems had largely disappeared. Belgian citizens, knowing that Charles's troops would pass through their villages, spontaneously organized to clear the snow. Along the way, the troops could see citizens in padded coats shoveling snow, men, women, and children, all working diligently, panting. When the French troops passed, they waved enthusiastically and greeted them loudly in French. "Hello, we salute you, thank you, friends from France, you are heroes, please give my regards to General Charles." Sometimes Charles was among them, but he hid in an armored reconnaissance vehicle to avoid being recognized. Charles didn't want them to recognize him, as it would bring unnecessary trouble or even danger. Leuven, the temporary headquarters of the German 21st Army. Nicholas and Erwin stared silently at the map, surrounded by busy staff officers rushing about, doing everything they could to understand the movements of Charles's troops via telephone and telegram. After a long silence, Nicholas finally asked, "Can Hasselt hold out?" Colonel Erwin answered decisively, "No, General. It's impossible. Hasselt only had 2 infantry regiments, and they were reserve forces for maintaining order and protecting the railway station and supplies, while their opponent was the 1st Armored Corps of the Charles." Nicholas's lips twitched. He stood up and pointed to the map, saying, "We might still have a chance. We can move our fighters to Hasselt, just like before. Our aircraft have a numerical advantage and could potentially gain air superiority. Once we gain air superiority from Hasselt, we can hold it until reinforcements arrive." Erwin slumped his head like a defeated rooster, his tone helpless. "It's too late, General. Charles' planes will take off from Brussels and Namur to intercept us. Meanwhile, his ground forces will arrive at Hasselt in about 10 hours. Then our planes will face not only camel fighters, but also Charles A1 tanks." Nicholas added, "We can reinforce Hasselt from 2 directions." The 2 directions referred to Leuven and the Liège fortress, especially the latter, where 2 infantry divisions were deployed. "General," Colonel Erwin shook his head, "the Liège fortress cannot reinforce Hasselt." "You know why?" Nicholas sighed and nodded slightly. The troops at Liège fortress were mostly fortress soldiers, trained to hold off the Charles's attacks around the fortress. Sending them to Hasselt would be a huge waste. More importantly, who could guarantee that the Charles wouldn't change their objective and attack Liège fortress instead? Erwin gritted his teeth. "Order a retreat, General. If it's too late, we might end up like Lieutenant General Baird." Lieutenant General Baird was the highest-ranking German general besieged in Ghent and surrendered to the Charles. He had become a negative example for the German army. Erwin never imagined that he would one day suffer a similar fate. "Retreat?" Nicholas looked at Erwin incredulously. "Do you know how many of our troops are on their way to attack? They've penetrated deep into Belgian territory, and it's impossible for them to return and break out of the encirclement within 10 hours. "I know," Erwin replied with difficulty, "but we can break out from other directions while the main Charles force attacks Hasselt. There's no other way." Nicholas slumped back into his chair. This meant that all the tanks were gone, and half of the fighters might have to be left behind, as Charles's planes were waiting for them on their retreat route. The Germans had spent so much time biding their time, painstakingly accumulating this equipment, only to have it all destroyed. "General," Erwin said, seeing Lieutenant General Nicholas's continued reluctance, emphasizing, "the question now isn't whether we can hold Hasselt, but whether our forces can break through, and how far they can escape." Lieutenant General Nicholas nodded. He trusted Erwin's judgment. Although the defeat was Erwin's fault, the outcome of the battle was beyond reproach. The reason they were ultimately trapped was because their opponent was Charles. No one could defeat Charles, losing to him wasn't shameful. Erwin remained the only one who had almost defeated Charles. After a moment, Lieutenant General Nicholas turned his gaze to the Dutch border on the map and said slowly, "Perhaps we can have more men break out of the encirclement." Irwin understood what Lieutenant General Nicholas meant, and he nodded. That might be a way. After all, the Netherlands was surrounded by Germany. In this era where force determines everything, if the Netherlands, a neutral country, did not make a fair choice, it might face a German attack. Chapter 611. As long as you don't pay attention, there won't be any trouble. I have something to do today, only one chapter, sorry. At 4:30 a.m., Charles's troops arrived in Hasselt ahead of schedule. Charles originally planned to rest for 2 hours and launch the attack at dawn, since fighting in the dark is very disadvantageous for tanks, as cluster grenades could be thrown from buildings and ruins at any time, crippling them. However, when Charles arrived, he found that this was unnecessary. Before the army even entered the city, Hasselt was already in chaos with gunfire everywhere. Many buildings were on fire, the whole city was like a burning torch, and Belgians were running around and cheering everywhere. In the firelight, a few lone German soldiers could be vaguely seen being beaten by Belgian civilians. When the French army arrived, the Belgians lined the streets to welcome them, carrying various weapons, including rifles, wooden sticks, farm tools, and kitchen knives. Tigny remained cautious, sending out his staff to inquire about the situation. However, the answers he received from over a dozen people were inconsistent. "Hurry and chase them, friends, the Germans are about to escape, they have a defensive line in the city, we can't break through it, I heard the Germans have brought reinforcements for a counterattack, be careful." Tigny then gave up asking, realizing that further questioning might yield 100 different answers, and he dared not act rashly without a clear understanding of the situation. It wasn't until half an hour later that he found a militia leader who had infiltrated the city. Or rather, not found, but rather the leader himself approached him after learning of Charles's arrival. The officer, dressed in civilian clothes but wearing a military cap and carrying a pistol, excitedly reported to Charles as he was brought before him, "It's an honor to meet you, General. We've captured part of the train station and armed the people with the captured weapons. Most of the area is now under our control. Only the train station and the city hall are still being resisted by some German troops." Tigny spread a map in front of him and asked, "Can you point out where the enemy is and how many there are?" The commander hesitated for a long time looking at the map but couldn't give a clear answer. "The situation is chaotic, General," the commander replied. "Some buildings are unsure whether they are in German or friendly hands." Tigny shrugged helplessly and looked at Charles. He meant that the information was very limited, and the troops still didn't know where to attack. Charles understood the situation. In street fighting and night fighting, even regular troops sometimes couldn't figure things out, let alone guerrillas, militia, and armed civilians. It was good enough that they hadn't started fighting each other, or perhaps it had already happened, and more than once. They didn't care, because they could blame the Germans. "Send the tanks up," Charles ordered. "General," Tigny quickly objected, "this could cause unnecessary casualties. I think we should wait until dawn." Tanks were largely ineffective in the dark and would only become easy targets for the Germans. But Charles insisted, "We need to end the battle quickly to avoid complications. If the Germans are holding their positions in buildings, the tanks will be effective. We won't attack in army units, but rather disperse the tanks among the militia. Letting the militia guide the tanks' advance against those impenetrable strongpoints. The militia might not be able to describe the situation clearly on a map, but those actually fighting knew exactly where they were blocked and unable to advance." The battle unfolded exactly as Charles had predicted. The tanks advanced much faster than before, and by daybreak, Hasselt was completely under French control amidst cheers. The captured supplies far exceeded expectations. The train station contained 23 large underground warehouses, overflowing with supplies, food, weapons, and ammunition in countless quantities. 5 of these warehouses held fuel, both for tanks and aircraft. These were scarce resources for the French army, instantly relieving the 1st Panzer Corps fuel shortage. Charles then deployed a batch of fighter planes, which, in conjunction with Brussels and Namur airfields, formed an air defense network against the German Air Force, preventing their withdrawal. Amsterdam, the capital of the Netherlands, was a small fishing village in the 12th century, but by now it had become the most important port and largest city in the Netherlands. Queen Wilhelmina, having finished her morning duties, stood by her office window gazing at the snowscape below, a glass of wine gently swirling in her hand. Her state of mind was like the falling snow, obscuring all ugliness, leaving only beauty to be seen. The image above shows Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands. The war had now entered its third year, and Queen Wilhelmina was largely unaware of its development. Even Charles, now renowned throughout the world, had only heard of it briefly. The Netherlands was a neutral country. She wouldn't participate in this war unrelated to her, so there was no need for her to pay attention. Or rather, the Queen feared attention, as it might inadvertently draw her in. Just then, the crisp sound of her secretary's high heels approached from behind, sounding somewhat hurried. The Queen didn't turn around. She believed that as long as she didn't participate in the war, there wouldn't be any insurmountable problems. However, trouble eventually came knocking. "Your Majesty," Secretary Louise reported, "the German ambassador wishes to speak with you." The Queen frowned slightly and asked, "About what?" "I think the Germans might want to pass through the Netherlands," Louise replied. The Queen turned sharply, staring at her secretary in shock. Louise handed the Queen a document, explaining as the Queen flipped through it, "Last night, Charles led the 1st Panzer Corps to surround over 200,000 German troops. The Germans have only two options to escape the encirclement. One is to break through Charles's defensive lines, the other is, pass through the Netherlands." The Queen saw the situation map. It was clear at a glance that the Germans had no way out. "Yes, Your Majesty." The Queen felt a chill run down her spine, as if a cold wind had swept across her face. Damn Charles. He should have used the Dutch border to encircle the Germans. He should have known he was diverting trouble to the Netherlands. What to do now? "Your Majesty," Louise reminded her, "the German ambassador is still waiting outside." After a moment's hesitation, the Queen replied, "Tell him to come later, I'm busy." Louise shook her head helplessly. "I already said that, but he said he'd wait outside indefinitely." "Let him in." The Queen sighed inwardly. She regretted not going abroad for a few days today. She should have known about the war situation beforehand, especially as the battlefield drew closer to the Netherlands. Chapter 612. Is this still neutral? Queen Wilhelmina met with a German ambassador in the reception room. The room was simple yet subtly luxurious, furnished with a few European-style sofas and a coffee table in the center. Small Dutch and German flags were temporarily displayed as a symbol of friendship between the two countries. The room was filled with the fragrance of tulips, with a hint of the Queen's French perfume. Unlike usual, the German ambassador, Stefan, was accompanied by his military attaché, Colonel Mark. Note, the military attaché is a special type of diplomat, representing the country's armed forces and serving as the ambassador's military assistant. The two strode up to Queen Wilhelmina, bowed, and, after receiving permission, sat opposite her, while the attaché stood beside him, head held high like a guard. The Queen glanced at Colonel Mark. She knew what the Germans meant. If diplomacy failed, they would resort to force, a psychological suggestion and a form of intimidation. The Queen remained composed, smiling slightly. "Long time no see, Stephen. You've come at the perfect time. I was just about to discuss imports with you. We're preparing to expand our imports of oil and arms from the United States, as well as other supplies." The Netherlands was a neutral country, free to import goods from other countries without British restrictions, including oil and arms, which were also major sources of supplies for Germany. The Queen was subtly implying to the German ambassador that if negotiations broke down, Germany would lose the benefits it received from the Netherlands, so he shouldn't act rashly. Stephen, of course, understood the unspoken message. If it were anything else, Stephen would have been overjoyed to receive the Queen's promise and would have put other matters aside for the time being. But now, with over 200,000 German troops surrounded and the situation urgent, this couldn't be suppressed by mere supplies. "Of course, Your Majesty," Stephen said with a hint of helplessness, "we are very grateful for your understanding and assistance to our country, but the flames of war have reached the Dutch border. We hope your country can demonstrate humanitarianism and open its borders to allow refugees to enter." "Refugees?" The Queen looked at Stephen, her gaze meaningful. "Yes," Stephen leaned forward slightly, adding, "I assure you they are unarmed, they won't even have uniforms, they are refugees." The Queen hesitated. This was an attempt to give the Netherlands a way out. All the Queen had to do was pretend not to know, feign ignorance, and nod in agreement. This excuse could also be used with Britain and France. "We are innocent, we didn't know, we were deceived." But the Queen knew in her heart that Britain and France wouldn't be so easily fooled. She gently picked up her coffee and took a sip, her voice tinged with helplessness. "I hope you understand our situation, Stephen. We don't want to be dragged into this war, not at any time." As a queen, she couldn't say, We have to consider Britain and France's ideas. That would be humiliating, a surrender to foreign powers, an interference in her internal affairs. I understand, Your Majesty, Stephen replied, but I believe this is precisely the only way for the Netherlands to remain neutral. What do you say? This was a warning to the Queen that if the Netherlands did not agree to this plan, Germany would have no choice but to take action. Before the Queen could answer, Mark, standing beside Stephen, added, Your Majesty, we all respect the Netherlands' neutrality, and I believe England and France do too. This was a reminder to the Queen that England and France, fearing a complete Dutch defection to Germany, would not easily take action. The Queen smiled slightly. Not a single word they spoke was related to war, yet every word carried a veil of hostility. Weighing the options, if the Netherlands were sensible, it should reluctantly agree to accept the refugees from Germany. After some consideration, the Queen sighed inwardly. She seemed to have no other choice. The saying a weak nation has no diplomacy held true. The Netherlands, surrounded by Germany on land, seemed to have no choice but to risk accepting German refugees. As for England and France, they could only hope they wouldn't completely break with the Netherlands over this matter. Just as the Queen was about to agree, her secretary entered and whispered a few words to her. The Queen's expression changed drastically upon hearing this, and she immediately stood up, saying to the two, I'm very sorry, I need to leave for a moment and also need time to consider. Please wait a moment. Of course, the two replied, rising to watch the Queen leave. Then Mark sensed something was amiss. He frowned and said to Stephen, Your Excellency, the secretary came in and said something before the Queen left. This means, Stephen nodded, it means she didn't need time to consider, but rather she needed to see someone. I guess it was the British or French ambassador. Mark suddenly understood. They also guessed that we wanted to pass through the Netherlands. Of course, Stephen replied, since Charles devised the encirclement plan to infiltrate Hasselt, of course he would have guessed this. But you, Colonel Mark asked doubtfully, why didn't you stop the Queen earlier? We couldn't stop her. Stephen casually crossed his legs, nor was there any need to. In the end, the Queen only had this one option. Colonel Mark thought about it and agreed. The German threat was imminent, while the British and French threats were far away, and might not even exist. Considering this, the Netherlands could only address the immediate threat before considering the long-term consequences. At worst, they could agree to give the Allies more supplies to quell the anger of Britain and France. At that moment, a communications officer rushed in and reported to Stephen, Your Excellency, Charles's 1st Armored Corps has crossed Hasselt and reached the Dutch border, while the main British fleet is assembling in the North Sea. Note, the North Sea is a Dutch name meaning Northern Sea, located in northwestern Europe, and is different from the North Sea in my country. What? Stephen jumped up from the sofa in surprise. He understood. Charles had not only thought of it, but had also made thorough preparations. Now, for the Netherlands, once it agreed to Germany's conditions, the threat it faced was no longer a distant one, but a real, immediate, and enormous threat from both land and sea. At sea, there was the world's most powerful Royal Navy. On land, there was Charles's 1st Armored Corps, which could reach the capital in just a few days and penetrate the entire Netherlands in a dozen days. Note, the Netherlands is 300 kilometers long from north to south. Under these circumstances, would the German threat still be effective? Sure enough. When the Queen met with the French ambassador in another reception room, the ambassador bluntly told her, Your Majesty, we respect the Netherlands' neutrality, and we hope that the Netherlands will continue to maintain its neutrality. Since the Netherlands is neutral, we have reason to demand that whatever powers the Netherlands grants to Germany, Britain and France should enjoy the same rights. The Queen was stunned. This meant that if the Netherlands accepted German refugees, it would have to accept British and French refugees. Was this still neutrality? Would the Netherlands become a battlefield? Chapter 613 Maintaining the Status Quo. After Charles's 1st Panzer Corps captured Hasselt, he handed it over to the Belgian 1st Special Reconnaissance Corps for defense. In some ways, the Belgian army was better suited to defend Hasselt. It was a Belgian city, where Albert I could easily muster a militia force. Under his unified command, the regular army and militia could unite to resist foreign invasion, achieving several times their usual fighting strength. The 1st Panzer Corps, now free, continued its advance, reaching the Belgian-Dutch border a few hours later. Seeing the French army massing at the border, the Dutch soldiers were on high alert, immediately deploying troops to organize defenses in the trenches with rifles. Tigony and his French soldiers looked at the Dutch defenses and soldiers with disbelief. Their fortifications consisted only of simple barbed wire, there were no anti-tank ditches or fortifications, the trenches weren't widened, and after half an hour, only one infantry regiment had been deployed. On the other hand, the French forces opposite them consisted of tanks, armored vehicles, self-propelled artillery, and occasionally a dozen or so fighter planes flying overhead for support. Tigony could even picture the despair in the eyes of the Dutch soldiers, clutching their crosses, trembling and praying they wouldn't become enemies of France. Otherwise, this steel army would crush them like vermin. The two images above show the Dutch army during World War I. Although the Netherlands was neutral during the war, it actively expanded its military due to being surrounded by several major powers, one characteristic being its large arsenal of dog machine guns. Tigony put away his binoculars and turned to Charles, who was munching on bread in the driver's seat of a reconnaissance vehicle. His tone was disdainful. "General, they want to hold off our entire armored corps with a single infantry regiment." Charles chewed his frozen bread with difficulty and replied, "You should understand them, Major General. Although they claim to be prepared to defend the country, this preparation is severely outdated. At the same time, their borders are long, making it impossible to prepare sufficient troops in every direction." Tigony nodded. He was used to dealing with the Germans and was somewhat unaccustomed to seeing the Dutch fortifications and troop strength. "Organized defenses," Charles said. "Organized defenses," Tigony relayed Charles's order. This was no easy task in the snow. Sometimes the soldiers even had to burn a pile of frozen soil before they could dig it open. But Charles wasn't in a hurry. His purpose wasn't to defend here, but to display his military might and formation to the Queen of the Netherlands. Amsterdam, Queen Wilhelmina, caught in a dilemma, paced anxiously in her office. She had already left the ambassadors of the two countries aside, or rather, the ambassadors of three countries, as the British ambassador had arrived after the French ambassador. However, the British ambassador and the French ambassador had agreed on a united front. Germany, or Britain and France? Queen Wilhelmina urgently summoned Lieutenant General Thomas, a pillar of the Dutch army who had participated in numerous wars against the colonies. The Queen believed he was the one who truly understood the stakes. Soon, Lieutenant General Thomas rushed into the Queen's office. Before the Lieutenant General could even salute, the Queen stepped forward and asked, "You already know the situation, General. What do you think we should do, Your Majesty?" Lieutenant General Thomas replied crisply, "I hope you understand. Charles's 1st Panzer Corps once marched dozens of kilometers in a single day to capture Antwerp, surrounding over 100,000 German troops and forcing their surrender. Now, in another day, they marched to Hasselt and surrounded over 200,000 German troops, and his forces number only a little over 20,000, and the situation remains the same." The Queen, not very knowledgeable about military matters, looked at Lieutenant General Thomas in shock. "You mean, over 20,000 men surrounded over 200,000 German troops? How did he do that?" "Tanks, Your Majesty," Lieutenant General Thomas replied helplessly. "This new equipment can destroy any fortified position, cross trenches, and render all obstacles utterly ineffective." Then Lieutenant General Thomas added, "The Germans might be overlooked. They are fighting on multiple fronts and are desperately short of manpower. They will not go to war with the Netherlands unless absolutely necessary. The British can perhaps be ignored. They sent warships. Ground occupation ultimately requires the army, and the British army is trapped in the Somme and suffering heavy casualties." But Charles' 1st Panzer Corps, Lieutenant General Thomas swallowed hard, saying with difficulty, "This force can wipe out the Netherlands as easily as playing a game. They won't even suffer many casualties, and it won't take more than a few days." The Queen's face was ashen, and she nodded slightly to indicate that she understood. But even so, the Queen still dared not make a decision easily. She worried that if she sided with Britain and France, the German army would launch a war for the more than 200,000 trapped troops. On the Belgian-Dutch border, in an unfinished trench, soldiers around were using entrenching tools to build trenches. Tigony and Charles sat around a fire to warm themselves. "Do you think the Queen will side with us?" Tigony skewered bread on a branch and roasted it over the fire. He wanted something hot. "She will." Charles' eyes were fixed on the slightly charred bread, and he suddenly felt hungry again. "Why?" Tigony carefully turned the twig to ensure the bread heated evenly. "I mean, how can you be so sure?" "Want to know?" Charles asked. "Yes, then trade something." Tigony paused, noticing Charles's gaze fixed on the toast. He suddenly laughed. "No problem, "General, it's my pleasure." He handed the twig to Charles. "It's yours." This guy would actually sell his dignity for a piece of toast. Charles took it, eagerly tearing off the charred crust, instantly releasing a fragrant aroma. Ignoring the bread was still hot, he took a bite. The taste was indeed much better than cold. It not only filled his stomach but also warmed his body. "Because I gave the Queen a solution," Charles answered vaguely. "A solution that would allow them to remain neutral?" "What?" Tigny was skeptical. He thought that in this situation, the Netherlands had no choice but to choose sides, either the Allied powers or the Central powers. Yet, Charles had a way to maintain the status quo in the Netherlands. In Amsterdam, the French ambassador offered the Queen a suggestion: "Your Majesty, if the Germans dare to violate the Netherlands' neutrality, then it is perfectly reasonable for you to allow British and French troops to pass through the Netherlands." "No one will find anything wrong with that." The Queen's eyes lit up. "That's right. This way, Charles's troops could bypass the Liege fortress and directly attack German territory." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 614: Absolute Neutrality. Queen Wilhelmina, upon hearing the French ambassador's words, not only showed no anger but actually relaxed. Perhaps out of caution, she did not directly reply to the German ambassador but instead returned to her office to find Lieutenant General Thomas. Lieutenant General Thomas was restless. Although he knew that the country he dared not offend most was France, or more precisely, the 1st Panzer Army of Charles, the Netherlands shared a long border with Germany to the east, and angering Germany would be something the small Netherlands could not afford. Queen Wilhelmina entered confidently, spread a map before Lieutenant General Thomas, and asked, "Your Excellency, you just said that the 1st Panzer Army of Charles can launch a rapid advance and reach Amsterdam in a few days?" "Yes, Your Majesty." Lieutenant General Thomas bowed slightly. Then, Queen Wilhelmina asked again, "What if the 1st Panzer Corps target isn't Amsterdam, but Germany?" Lieutenant General Thomas paused, staring at the map for a moment. "Perhaps, it would only take 2 days to reach German territory. Could the Germans possibly resist?" Queen Wilhelmina asked again. "I mean, Charles' 1st Panzer Corps?" "No, almost impossible." Lieutenant General Thomas shook his head. "The German forces are concentrated on the western and eastern fronts, leaving the interior very weak. They only have a small number of troops on the Dutch-German border, and their training and equipment are severely inadequate, and Charles' 1st Panzer Corps, even the elite German troops couldn't stop it. The fact that the Germans have been surrounded by Charles several times is proof of this." Thomas was puzzled. Why was Her Majesty asking this? Was she trying to use Charles against the Germans? But that wouldn't be easy. They weren't fools, especially Charles. He wouldn't be so easily manipulated by the Netherlands. Queen Wilhelmina nodded in satisfaction. She had gotten the answer she wanted. In the German ambassador's reception room, Stephen and Mark were already impatient. They knew that the combined British and French armies were pressing in on the Dutch border, threatening the Netherlands, which might influence Queen Wilhelmina's decision. "Do you think the Queen will choose to side with the Allies?" Stephen asked Mark. Mark hesitated for a moment, then replied, "I think the Queen is still hesitant. After all, Germany and the Netherlands share a border of over 500 kilometers. She has to consider that." Note, the German-Dutch border is 577 kilometers long. Stephen nodded slightly. His thinking was that the British fleet would eventually return. They couldn't stay in the North Sea indefinitely. Charles's 1st Panzer Corps only had a force of about 20,000 men, insufficient to deter the Dutch. And the German-Dutch border stretched for over 500 kilometers. Any point could become a German breach, which was what the Netherlands truly needed to worry about. Finally, Queen Wilhelmina returned, smiling, walking with a light step, head held high, radiating confidence. Stephen assumed Queen Wilhelmina had made up her mind to side with Germany, and he proudly went to greet her. "Your Majesty." Stephen bowed, his voice filled with joy. "I am honored that you made the right choice." "Of course, Stephen," the Queen said, sitting on the sofa and gesturing for them to sit down as well. "So, where do we begin?" Stephen asked. "Please forgive my haste, Your Majesty. But over 200,000 people's no small matter for us." "I know," the Queen nodded with a smile, "but this seems irrelevant to the Netherlands." Stephen's face darkened. "Your Majesty, what do you mean?" "I mean, we will always remain neutral, the Queen maintained her composure. Absolute neutrality, as we have always declared. Seeing that Stephen still didn't understand, the Queen added, "Do you remember 2 years ago when your army entered Belgium and attacked Antwerp?" Stephen hummed in agreement. "Of course, Your Majesty. At that time, many Belgian refugees crossed the Dutch-Belgian border to seek refuge in the Netherlands," the Queen said seriously. "But you demanded that we remain neutral and refused these refugees entry into the Netherlands, so we closed the border." Stephen understood. His face darkened, his voice tinged with anger. "You mean, the Netherlands will close its border?" "Yes," the Queen straightened her back, her tone unhurried. "Those are the real refugees, Stephen. If even real refugees can't pass, how can we allow refugees who have laid down their weapons and taken off their uniforms to pass? My ministers and I have discussed this, and they unanimously agree that it violates the Netherlands' neutrality." A cold glint flashed in Stephen's eyes, his voice carrying a hint of threat. "Then, I hope you've thought it through, Your Majesty." "We have thought it through," the Queen met Stephen's gaze. "This is our final decision." Mark stepped forward. "I don't think you can bear the consequences of this decision, Your Majesty." "I think so too." The Queen looked up at Mark's condescending gaze. "I don't think you can bear the consequences of this decision." "What do you mean?" Mark was confused. "Do I need to remind you?" The Queen leisurely picked up her coffee cup from the table. Although it was cold, she found it refreshingly sweet. The Queen put down her coffee cup, smiling, and continued, "Think about it. If you make a decision, the Netherlands might open a passage for Charles's armored divisions to pass through. I remember the Dutch-German border is over 500 kilometers long." Stephen and Mark froze instantly. The Queen's two seemingly unrelated sentences were actually telling them that Charles's 1st Panzer Corps could potentially break through from any point on the Dutch-German border. They had always thought the 500-kilometer-long Dutch-German border was a German advantage, something the Netherlands would have to yield to. Now, they suddenly realized it wasn't an advantage for Germany, but rather a disadvantage. Because Charles's 1st Panzer Corps could break into Germany from any point. Stephen turned to Mark, seemingly asking if the German army could stop Charles if they crossed into the Netherlands and attacked German territory. Mark's face was ashen, and he gently shook his head. It was impossible. If Charles's troops crossed into the Netherlands, the heavily fortified Liège fortress would be bypassed, and a 500-kilometer border would require at least 500,000 troops, and even that wasn't guaranteed to be held. Note, the entire Western Front is only 700 kilometers long. The Dutch-German border is practically another Western Front. "I understand, Your Majesty." Stephen rose and shook hands with the Queen, his attitude becoming much more humble. He truly understood that they had no leverage to threaten the Netherlands. Germany had to guarantee the Netherlands' status as a neutral country. Absolutely neutral. Chapter 615 nominates Charles as Commander-in-Chief. The Netherlands closed its borders, preventing refugees from passing through, thus cutting off the German army's hope of retreating to Germany via the Netherlands. This caused irreparable losses to the trapped German troops. They lost the best opportunity to break out, and their morale and confidence were severely damaged. There's a saying that the greater the hope, the greater the disappointment. If there had been no hope of retreating from the Netherlands from the beginning, the German army would have broken out from Hasselt at all costs. Now, with hope present, it was ruthlessly extinguished, which led to widespread apathy among the German troops, with many even choosing to surrender rather than break out. Lieutenant General Nicholas and Colonel Irwin were unwilling to give up. They organized over 100,000 remnants to break out in several directions. However, only a mere 10,000 or so ultimately escaped the encirclement. This was related to Charles's preparations. While the German army was gathering at the Dutch border, Charles had already brought in a large number of landmines and rockets from the Netherlands. The Parliament, unusually supportive, dispatched over 40 trains to transport the supplies day and night, with an average of one train arriving in Namur every hour to unload the munitions before they were transported to the front lines by truck. Next, a large number of landmines, especially S-shaped bounding mines, were laid along the infiltration line from Namur to Hasselt, and the Belgian 1st Special Reconnaissance Corps was also equipped with rocket launchers and rockets. If the German troops attempted to break out, they would first have to navigate through the minefield, then endure a barrage of rockets, then the Belgian infantry lines, and finally escape the pursuit of the Charles 1st Panzer Corps in air power. Very few succeeded in breaking out. Most chose to give up during the breakout process and surrendered directly to the Belgian and French forces. Lieutenant General Nicholas and Colonel Irwin successfully escaped, They were picked up by plane. If there was any loophole in this encirclement, it was that the planes could fly out under the cover of darkness. This was the safest and fastest method. At this time, fighter planes lacked night fighting capabilities and could only let them fly out. Snow was falling heavily in Paris, France. It was past 5 in the morning, and many people were still asleep. Only housewives, yawning, turned on the lights and prepared breakfast for their families. The streets were deserted, with only a few cars passing by occasionally, their headlights casting snowflake-like shadows on the walls. Suddenly, someone shouted, "Charles has won. The Germans have surrendered." Others excitedly opened their windows and yelled, "Charles has won. He's captured 210,000 Germans, 210,000. The shouts echoed one after another, lights came on one by one, and soon the whole city was in an uproar. Some people rushed into the streets in their pajamas to cheer, others ran around spreading the news, and still others ran naked through the streets, shouting hysterically like madmen. Brian received a phone call at home. "Really? Are you sure? 210,000 Germans have surrendered. God, he has saved France once again. He has created another miracle. Notify Clemenceau, have him come to my office immediately." Paris City Hall, Prime Minister's office. Clemenceau walked in, still half asleep. He tossed his hat and coat onto the sofa, casually placing his briefcase aside as he sat down, and yawned. Clemenceau had also heard the news of Charles's victory, but he didn't think it was worth getting out of bed and braving the cold wind and snow to come here. "Do you think this is good news, Your Excellency the Prime Minister?" Clemenceau asked. "Isn't it?" Brian, who was reading a detailed report, retorted. "Think about it, not long ago we were worried about the supply lines collapsing, worried that the Germans would reach Paris, and now everything is resolved, and we've even captured 210,000 Germans. 210,000, Your Excellency." Brian rose and handed Clemenceau a glass of red wine, then continued, "I think we should learn a lesson. I mean, we almost put France in danger. This meant that Parliament should tone down its pressure on Charles, lest it nearly backfire again." Clemenceau shook his head slightly. "You've overlooked one point, Your Excellency the Prime Minister. All of this seems to be part of Charles's plan, including our suppression of him." "You mean?" Brian was taken aback. Clemenceau picked up his briefcase, rummaged through it, took out a document, and stood up to hand it to Brian, who was sitting opposite him. "This is the Second Bureau's investigation report," Clemenceau replied. "Charles has been conserving ammunition and supplies ever since he left Jean-Baptiste. While we thought his troops would lose combat effectiveness due to lack of supplies, Charles was in control of everything." Brian opened a document, flipped through it, and looked at Clemenceau in astonishment. "So, the situation isn't as dangerous as we thought?" "Yes," Clemenceau nodded. "There's also the British. Charles has actually established some kind of cooperation with the British Navy and the Minister of Warfare. His echo detector was used on the French Navy and successfully broke a German submarine blockade of the shipping lanes." "Do you know what this means?" Brian nodded thoughtfully. "This means that Charles is expanding his influence towards the Navy. At the same time, he has, to some extent, controlled supplies." Clemenceau leaned back, adopting a lazy posture, and summarized, "Charles' power is growing, almost all soldiers and civilians are his loyal followers, and now he's extending his reach to the Navy and supplies. And are we thinking about whether to loosen our grip on him?" Clemenceau answered his own question. "No, I don't think we should do that." Brian fell silent, feeling deceived by Charles. Charles was using his military genius to continuously enhance his prestige and power, and now he was showing signs of breaking free from Parliament's control. But what should they do now? Brian thought of Foch. "Therefore, we should support Foch," Brian said. Clemenceau nodded in agreement. "If, under Foch's command, the battles of Verdun and the Somme can be successfully concluded, coupled with his accumulated resources, we can form a force to rival Charles." "That's not enough," a hint of worry flashed in Brian's eyes. "Yes," Clemenceau agreed. But he was also helpless. Charles's victories on the battlefield were remarkable, time and time again. Based on that alone, Charles was enough to defeat anyone who stood in his way. Brian considered for a moment and said, "Therefore, we should nominate Charles as commander-in-chief." Clemenceau suddenly looked up at Brian in shock. Had he gone mad? Nominate Charles as commander-in-chief? This was something Parliament had been avoiding mentioning, fearing it might come true, yet Brian was going to nominate him. But the next second, Clemenceau understood what was going on. Chapter 616 Intensifying the Conflict. The Battle of Hasselt caused a global sensation, with media outlets worldwide dedicating significant front-page coverage to the victory. The British newspaper The Times reported, only one day, just one day in total, although Germany surrendered on the fifth day after the battle, it took only one day from the departure of Char's 1st Panzer Corps to the decisive victory at Hasselt. Char has once again created his own legend. He defeated his opponent in just one day. Even more astonishing is that he achieved such a brilliant victory at the cost of only a little over 1,000 casualties, and even with the Belgian army, the total casualties were only a little over 8,000. Meanwhile, our fighting continues on the Somme, and our army can also catch up with Char in just one day. I'm referring to the casualty figures. The American newspaper Stars and Stripes stated, many people are skeptical of Char's tactics, believing his victory at Antwerp was luck, an unrepeatable accident, and that such a rapid end to the battle wouldn't have happened if the Germans had been prepared. Some even question the importance of tanks, considering them merely luxury toys. However, Char proved these views utterly wrong. Charles, with the Germans prepared, infiltrated Hasselt and, using the same tactics and the same troops, once again created an incredible miracle. The Russian newspaper St. Petersburg News also devoted a full page to the battle, emphasizing, the Allies are achieving victories on the Western Front, huge victories, first the Antwerp encirclement, then the Hasselt infiltration, each time encircling hundreds of thousands of German troops. We have reason to believe that as long as Charles' troops are present, there will be a third and fourth similar victories. Once the Germans collapse on the Western Front, they will be unable to maintain their offensive on the Eastern Front, and we are not far from victory. Russia desperately needed such propaganda, as it could inspire its people to continue the fight rather than descend into turmoil and uprising. Note, the St. Petersburg News, or News for short, was an official newspaper of Tsarist Russia, commissioned in 1702 and ceased publication in 1917 with the fall of Tsarist Russia. French and Belgian media reported every detail of the battle, analyzing each unit individually, with even minor skirmishes and casualties becoming hot topics. In Hasselt, Charles's command post was located in a brewery on the outskirts of the city. The brewery had been abandoned for some time, covered in cobwebs and dusty brewing equipment. During wartime, especially in times of scarcity, neither Germany nor the Allies could sustain a luxury industry like brewing. People prioritized filling their stomachs before enjoying a drink, and the sharp decline in market demand led to the closure of numerous breweries. This Limburg brewery was one of them. Charles's command post was in the spacious factory building, which he considered more suitable for wartime than the manager's office, at least preventing communication difficulties between departments separated by small offices. Charles sat leisurely at his desk, reading the newspaper. The battle had escalated to a point where he needed to command little more than wait for the Belgian army to receive prisoners and equipment. His daily updates consisted mainly of increased supplies and equipment. At that moment, Tycoon approached Charles with a telegram. It's good news, Lieutenant General. Parliament has nominated you to be Commander-in-Chief. The staff officers in the command post turned to look and gasped in surprise, then beamed with joy. It should have been this long ago. No one is more suitable to be Commander-in-Chief than the Lieutenant General. Yes, the Lieutenant General should command all the troops. This war will soon be over, and we will achieve final victory. Charles remained unmoved, his gaze fixed on the newspaper. His breakfast was still mashed potatoes and pungent Limburg cheese. If there was any difference, it was that the Limburg cheese was much larger, more than twice the size of before. Charles inquired about the reason, and the staff officer replied, Hasselt is the capital of Limburg province, Lieutenant General. There's plenty of Limburg cheese here. He placed the cheese as far away as possible, ate his watery mashed potatoes, which resembled vegetable soup, with a spoon, and casually asked, why do you say it's good news? Tycoon pulled up a stool and sat down opposite Charles. I don't think the Parliament will make you Commander-in-Chief so easily, General. This is something they've always avoided. Charles nodded approvingly. Tycoon's political understanding had improved, at least compared to the staff officers around him. You're right. Charles put down his newspaper, took a napkin to wipe his mouth, and ended his breakfast, which he had only eaten to stave off hunger. They want to exacerbate the conflict between me and the others. Exacerbate the conflict. Tycoon was taken aback, then suddenly realized, Foch, and Pétain, and the army group commander who aspires to become Commander-in-Chief, and the British, Charles added. Yes, and the British. Tycoon nodded in understanding. The British hoped to control the French army by controlling the commander-in-chief, but Charles clearly wouldn't be controlled by the British. Therefore, everyone would target Charles, and the British might even send intelligence agents to frame and slander him. Meanwhile, the old men in Parliament wouldn't need to do anything, they would merely nominate him in Parliament, not actually approve him, yet Charles would still be surrounded by others. So, Tigny stared at Charles. "What do you plan to do?" Tigny's voice held a hint of anxiety. He absolutely believed in Charles's military genius, but the political struggle, with so many opponents and many lurking in the shadows, was beyond Charles's ability to handle. Charles smiled slightly. "We'll deal with whatever comes our way." The situation wasn't as bad as Tigny thought. Charles believed few in the military would fall for it. For example, Foch and Pétain. Would they consider Charles an enemy because of a mere feint by Parliament? These two old men knew Parliament's methods well. They believed Parliament wouldn't allow Charles, a capitalist who combined military, political, and economic power, to become commander-in-chief. If they believed that, they wouldn't deserve to be Charles's adversaries. So, at most, only a few fools would believe this and target Charles. Parliament's actions wouldn't be very effective. Secondly, and more importantly, Charles is controlling supplies through echo detectors, regardless of who lent you the money or who bought the supplies from the US. Offending Charles will likely result in being sunk by German submarines. Therefore, even if British capitalists can't do anything to Charles, and are even controlled by him, with this foundation, what kind of trouble can they possibly cause? Chapter 617 The Price of War. Pétain and Foch both called to express their trust in Charles. Pétain congratulated Charles in a friendly tone. "Another world-renowned victory, Lieutenant General. I am proud of you, and France is proud of you. Furthermore, I heard they nominated you to be commander-in-chief. This is one of the few decisions I agree with from the Parliament. I even think you are the most suitable candidate." Without a doubt, even the current commander-in-chief, Pétain still subtly criticized Foch. On the surface, Foch maintained his skepticism towards Charles. He published an article in the Meritorious Service, subtly pointing out that Charles's victory in this battle had a great deal of randomness and was not the Norman War. On the other hand, he sent Charles a secret telegram through Wei Gang. "A brilliant battle, Lieutenant General, congratulations. In addition, I think your victories at sea are more important at this stage." Charles nodded in agreement. For Charles, any victories on land were merely tactical. The Parliament could use any excuse to manipulate him. Even a complete defeat of the Germans would be disadvantageous for Charles, because once the birds are gone, the bow is put away, meaning Parliament could then deal with Charles without restraint. On the other hand, the sea lanes, which determine Charles's control over supplies, are strategic, holding the lifeline of all capitalists, including Parliament. On the south bank of the Somme, Foch sat at his desk, staring blankly at a map showing the troop deployments of the British, French, and German forces along the Somme. In the distance, artillery fire intensified, followed by incessant gunfire. The British launched another attack on the German lines. Since Charles's victory at Hasselt, the British had been acting like madmen, launching wave after wave of attacks on the Germans, even deploying the Camel fighter planes imported from Charles. Foch knew why. Britain's prestige as the world's leading power was facing an unprecedented challenge. The colonial armies had lost faith in Britain. Not only the African troops, but even the Indian and Australian troops, traditionally known for their loyalty, preferred to cooperate with the French rather than the British. These armies were even using British equipment. But Foch wasn't thinking about that, nor about the stalemate on the Somme battlefield. He was thinking about Charles. Foch was considering a question: if Charles were to become commander-in-chief, could he accept it? From a personal perspective, Foch was unwilling to accept it, even finding it difficult, because it meant a complete rejection of Foch. At this stage, the tactical theory used by France was Foch's offensive theory. Even with the emergence of Pétain's defensive theory and Charles's adaptability theory, the offensive theory remained the mainstream, and Foch remained the most important founder of tactical theory, an unshakable figure. Once Charles became commander-in-chief and vigorously promoted his adaptability theory, Foch's era would end, and his obsolescence might be much faster than imagined. However, was this really important? Foch looked up, listening to the direction from which the cannon fire and gunfire were coming. The British were using typical offensive tactics, which meant death, stalemate, and meaningless attrition. Foch felt like a sinner, a murderer, an executioner. having pushed countless lives onto the battlefield to become corpses, including those of the enemy, in order to maintain the correctness of his theories. Charles's tactics, however, could encircle and capture the enemy at minimal cost, deciding the outcome while allowing most of both sides' soldiers to survive. No, I cannot continue like this. Charles is right, his theories and tactics are the inevitable trend, and anyone who stands against him will ultimately fail. Therefore, I must support him, no matter how you look at it. General, Colonel Bruce stood at attention and saluted Foch. After a moment, seeing no response, he called out again, puzzled. Foch snapped out of his daze, looked up, and saw Colonel Bruce standing before him. He was initially taken aback, then asked expressionlessly, his tone mocking, "What are your orders, Colonel?" Colonel Bruce was Higgs' staff officer. He was fluent in French and stationed on the south bank of the Somme, ostensibly to promote coordination between the British and French armies, but in reality, he was conveying the needs of the British Expeditionary Force to Foch. Foch would never forget Colonel Bruce's hypocritical face. He appeared outwardly gentlemanly, but his eyes were full of disdain, and his tone carried a threat. "We will provide your army with supplies as needed, General. I hope you understand that during wartime, supplies are often unavailable even with money." Now, Colonel Bruce stood before Foch again, impeccably polite and humble. "It's like this," Colonel Bruce said, taking a document from his briefcase and handing it to him. "We hope your army can cooperate with ours. This is tomorrow's battle plan." Foch took the document and glanced at it. French artillery had been moved to the front lines to bombard the German positions on the north bank of the Somme from the flanks. Foch frowned at first, then couldn't help but laugh. Such a perfect battle plan. Colonel Bruce, of course, could hear the sarcasm in Foch's words, but he remained unfazed. "You think so too? That's excellent. We all know that the French defenses on the south bank have advanced about 3 kilometers, while the British defenses are still in the rear. Then, the French only need to move their artillery to the front lines to bombard the enemy's defenses and even their artillery positions from the flanks. This will greatly help the British offensive." Note, the French defenses on the Somme River advanced 5 kilometers in one go due to Charles's infiltration along the river, creating an uneven difference in elevation between the north and south banks. Foch retorted, "This will indeed greatly help the British offensive, Colonel. I admit that, but have you considered that once our artillery is moved to the front lines and opens fire, they will be caught in a pincer attack by German artillery from two sides. They could be blown to bits in an instant, leaving not a trace." Colonel Bruce calmly raised an eyebrow. "This is the price of war, isn't it?" His words were a double entendre, referring not only to the cost of war itself, but also to the cost of the French army's acquisition of supplies. Foch smiled. "Yes, this is indeed the price of war, but you seem to have forgotten that the French Navy sank 12 German submarines." With that, Foch tossed a pre-prepared newspaper in front of Colonel Bruce. Colonel Bruce's expression froze. "I don't understand what you mean, General." Foch narrowed his eyes. "I want to know, what price will you pay for this war, Colonel? With a single order from me, the British Army will receive no supplies whatsoever." Chapter 618 Ownership of the Echo Detector. Hasselt, Belgium. After several days of cleaning up, most of the besieged German troops had surrendered, and the siege of Antwerp had lifted on its own. Albert I and Major General Eden were extremely busy, collecting prisoners of war and inventorying spoils of war town by town. However, they were very meticulous in their protocol, reporting to Charles after each recaptured territory and sending a complete list of spoils to Charles's headquarters before daring to use or distribute them, only after Charles's signature. From Charles's perspective, this was unnecessary. In principle, Albert I, Major General Eden, and indeed all the Belgian troops were not his subordinates and did not need to obey his orders, but Albert I insisted on doing so. That noon, Charles was signing documents in the command post, munching on bread to stave off hunger, and couldn't help but complain, "My God, doesn't he know this will increase my burden? Just signing orders almost crippled me." The 6th Army commander already had a lot of work to do, including the hundreds of thousands of people in Belgium. The regular army numbered nearly 500,000, plus over 800,000 militia. Tidjane, who was eating canned vegetables, laughed. "I think this is a very smart move." What? Charles didn't understand Tidjane's meaning. He thought that Albert I, considering Belgium's independence, should try every means to seize military power, which was one of the reasons Charles tried to control the FN arms factory. However, Tidjane didn't think so. "He has already chosen you, General. You are the only one who can guarantee Belgium's security, now and in the future. In the future, Charles looked at Tycoon in confusion. Yes, Tycoon nodded. He grimaced as he stirred the indistinguishable paste in the can with a spoon. Its taste and appearance made it difficult for him to swallow. He forced a spoonful, swallowed it with difficulty as if taking medicine, and nearly vomited from nausea. After a while, he looked up, pale-faced, and replied, "Think about it, General. Belgium is sandwiched between Britain, Germany, and France. It needs a solid backer, and that backer is you." Charles seemed to understand. Germany would be defeated in the future, while Britain's strength lay in its navy. From Belgium's perspective, the gamble had to be on France. And if a power had to be chosen from France, it would inevitably be Charles. This was perhaps the main reason why Albert I was so desperate to win him over. Charles felt that his previous actions had been somewhat unnecessary. He had previously wanted to control Belgium by controlling the FN arsenal, but now it seemed unnecessary. At this moment, a telegram was delivered by a staff officer. It was sent by Foch through Wegang. "We have basically broken free from British control. Continue to maintain naval superiority and do not allow any other power to get their hands on the echo detector. No power at all." Charles casually stuffed the telegram into his pocket. This was a private telegram that he didn't need to let Tycoon know. "Business matters," Tycoon said dismissively. "Yes," Charles replied. Just as Charles was putting away his unfinished bread, preparing to end his meal, another telegram arrived. "General, the Minister of the Navy is discussing the purchase of the industrial rights to the echo detector with Professor Fessenden. Furthermore, the British have also sent representatives who seem interested in purchasing it as well." Charles was startled. He had considered the possibility of Britain doing this, but he hadn't expected the French Navy to be interested as well. Tycoon reminded him, "Not the French Navy, General, it's Parliament." Charles instantly understood. Once the patent fell into the Navy's hands, the echo detector would be controlled by Parliament, not Charles. Parliament finally understood the key point. At the Brest shipyard, Professor Fessenden had his own laboratory. The laboratory was enormous, possessing a simulation testing platform converted from an indoor swimming pool, allowing many experiments to be conducted indoors without being affected by external winds, waves, or darkness. Professor Fessenden and his assistants were working intensively on improving the echo detector. Data from actual combat showed that although the echo detector had achieved significant success, hunting down 12 submarines in its first engagement and sinking 5 more, a record exceeding the total number of submarines killed before. Note, Germany lost 199 submarines during World War I, most of which were sunk after being equipped with sonar. However, Professor Fessenden knew this was far from enough. "The biggest shortcoming is the detection range." Professor Fessenden set a new goal for the laboratory. "Insufficient detection range will increase the difficulty of tracking submarines, and coupled with unstable signals and errors, our warships will easily lose targets." "Professor," someone objected, "but based on actual combat data, the probability of losing targets is not high, idiot." Professor Fessenden retorted bluntly, "That's because the Germans don't know about the echo detector yet. Their submarines always escape in a straight line underwater instead of evading. Once they know, the data won't be what you see." Professor Fessenden had personally boarded ships and discussed his experience using the echo detector with sailors, captains, and operators. He believed that only in this way could he truly understand the needs of actual combat and make the echo detector even more perfect. Just as Professor Fessenden and his assistant were engrossed in discussing improvement plans at their desks, several officers in naval uniforms entered the laboratory, led by an admiral in a splendid uniform. Noticing the commotion, Professor Fessenden looked up, startled by the scene before him, and quickly put down his work to greet them. The admiral rushed forward to shake Professor Fessenden's hand. "Hello, Professor. Let me introduce myself. I am the French Minister of the Navy. Thank you very much for your invention. It has played a very important role on the battlefield." Professor Fessenden keenly sensed that the admiral's praise was insincere, and knew that this was not the purpose of his visit. Because, it had been more than 10 days since the echo detector's great victory. If praise and reward were desired, the naval forces should have been present long ago. However, Professor Fessenden politely replied, "It is my duty, General." The Minister of the Navy glanced around and asked, "Can we speak privately?" "Of course." Professor Fessenden ushered the admiral into the conference room. The large conference room, besides the professor and the minister, also contained the minister's staff officer, who carried a briefcase. The admiral cut to the chase. I heard you hold the industrial rights to the echo detector. Yes, Professor Fessenden nodded. This was one of the conditions of his cooperation with Charles. But immediately, Professor Fessenden shook his head. But not entirely, General. I only intended to use it to detect icebergs. Detecting submarines was Charles's idea. I believe Charles owns at least a portion of the intellectual property rights. Chapter 619. This is a state secret. The Secretary of the Navy frowned slightly upon hearing this. To hell with Charles, every invention bears his mark. However, he remained composed, asking calmly, you mean the patent for the echo detector hasn't been applied for yet? No, it has been applied for, Professor Fessenden replied, but it hasn't been made public because it involves national security. The Secretary of the Navy asked again, is Charles a patent holder? Professor Fessenden paused for a moment before answering, no. To avoid unnecessary trouble, I am the sole patent holder. Charles was now an adult, and signing industrial patents required his personal presence. Moreover, Charles spent most of his time commanding operations on the front lines. He couldn't abandon the battle and rush back just to sign a patent. Then there's no problem. The Secretary of the Navy smiled again. The law only recognizes the patent documents. We can ignore some unnecessary factors. This meant Charles could be excluded. No, General, Professor Fessenden replied. I can't do that. Like I said, Charles has a share in the patent. I know, Charles knows, everyone in the lab knows. The Secretary of the Navy said nothing. He simply gestured with his chin towards the staff officer standing beside him. The staff officer understood and took a pre-filled check from his briefcase, handing it to Professor Fessenden. Professor Fessenden glanced at the amount and froze. He even doubted his eyes, adjusting his glasses to get a closer look. Yes, it was $20 million. Good heavens, this money was enough for him to live a life of luxury, or to establish his own laboratory and conduct his research. Professor Fessenden's breathing quickened involuntarily. His gaze lingered on the amount on the check, unable to move, as if it possessed some kind of magic. The Admiral added, considering you're an American citizen, we have decided to transact in US dollars. Are you satisfied? Of course, General, Fessenden replied. The United States was a neutral country, and its currency had always been stable. However, Professor Fessenden knew this contained an implication. If Fessenden worried about Shire's retaliation and suppression, he could sell his patents and return to the United States. Professor Fessenden hesitated for a moment, then looked up at the Admiral with a puzzled expression. But I don't understand, General. Charles is a French general, his equipment is French, why would you? That's none of your business, Professor, the Admiral interrupted. The Admiral tapped his finger on the check, emphasizing, this is just a transaction, cash on delivery, nothing more. As he spoke, a hint of threat flashed in the Admiral's eyes, as if to tell Professor Fessenden, there are some things you don't need to know, it won't do you any good. Professor Fessenden seemed to understand, though not entirely. He had always been apolitical, focused solely on his research. But he knew one thing, selling industrial property rights could be detrimental to Charles, even a betrayal. He glanced at the check reluctantly, then shook his head with difficulty. I'm sorry, General, I can't do that. The Admiral looked surprised, staring intently at Professor Fessenden. After a moment, he seemed to understand. Is it because of the money? Give me a number. No, it's not about the money, Professor Fessenden replied. Why is that? The Admiral asked, looking at Fessenden with a puzzled expression. It's because of development, General, Professor Fessenden replied. Cooperating with Charles yields many things that money can't buy. The Admiral narrowed his eyes. Like what? Creativity, platforms, talent, and much more. Professor Fessenden spoke with increasing conviction. These are things money can't buy, and I firmly believe that continuing to cooperate with Charles will bring me even more, including money. During his time working at the Brest shipyard, Professor Fessenden had come across Charles's new torpedo, and coupled with the countless pieces of equipment Charles had invented, Professor Fessenden believed that continuing to cooperate with Charles would ensure his research wouldn't stop at the echo detector. For a scientist, the most troubling thing is often not money, but creativity. And Charles was a goldmine of creativity. The Admiral seemed to understand. He sighed softly, had his staff put away the checks, and handed Professor Fessenden a business card. You don't need to reply immediately, Professor. If you change your mind one day, feel free to call me. Thank you. Fessenden shook hands with the admiral. But when he accepted the business card, he had already made up his mind that he would never make that call. That evening, the British Navy came to his door. It was General Winter, discussing the same issue of industrial property rights. General Winter tried to mislead Fessenden in a different way. "Perhaps you know a little, Professor," General Winter said casually, chatting with Fessenden over coffee. "I've known Charles for a long time. We could even be considered comrades in arms. In the Dardanelles, I was the fleet commander." "I've heard of that battle," Fessenden said, his eyes filled with admiration. Those who haven't been on the battlefield often view war with romanticism, or see it as a symbol of courage. General Winter, following Fessenden's lead, said, "Although we lost that battle, Charles won. I even regret not listening to Charles's advice from the beginning, otherwise, we might have won the war. A truly remarkable man, isn't he?" Professor Fessenden nodded repeatedly. "Yes, his legend is everywhere." No, those aren't legends, Professor," General Winter exclaimed sincerely. "Those are real events, facts." The two chatted amiably, finding common ground. Unbeknownst to Fessenden, General Winter subconsciously planted an impression in him. General Winter was Charles's friend, his fan, his admirer. Such a person wouldn't do anything detrimental to Charles. After talking for over half an hour, General Winter, seeing the time was right, made a seemingly reasonable suggestion. "I know you won't sell the industrial rights to the echo detector, Professor, so we just hope to obtain a production license for it. You know why? Britain is an ally of France, and we can fight German submarines alongside the French Navy. Undoubtedly, this will lighten Charles's burden and end this terrible war sooner, don't you think?" General Winter elevated the last sentence to the level of contributing to human peace. He knew this was what most scientists wanted to hear. They always hoped to be remembered in history for it. Fessenden almost agreed. He had no reason to refuse: fame, fortune, and no need to sell the rights. But just then, Charles pushed open the conference room door and walked in. "I'm sorry, General, this is a state secret. We will not trade with anyone." Chapter 620. Is there any chance for the Navy to win? Charles approached General Winter, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Hello, General, is this how you cooperate with me?" This was probably the typical behavior of a minister of munitions, who never cared about the opinions of his allies and would stop at nothing for personal gain. General Winter replied without batting an eye, "Isn't what I meant by cooperation? It's beneficial to both of us." Lieutenant General, Professor Fessenden, unaware of the implications, looked at Charles in confusion. General Winter isn't talking about purchasing the intellectual property, he's talking about licensing production." "It's not a matter of licensing production, Professor," Charles replied. "Once Britain obtains the production rights to the echo detector, the Royal Navy will abandon the French Navy as before." Professor Fessenden was taken aback, then suddenly realized the Royal Navy possessed the world's largest fleet, and Britain had a strong industrial production capacity. If they wanted, they could mass-produce the echo detector in a short time and equip it for the Royal Navy. At that time, the Royal Navy would no longer need to cooperate with the French Navy, and the French Navy would be sidelined and idle as before. Even with the echo detector, another meaning of having nothing to do is the loss of control of the sea and the opportunity for actual combat. Note, this is similar to the active participation of noble sons in the war during World War I. The tradition of European nobility was that they monopolized the right to wage war, turning wars into wars between noble knights. This allowed the nobles to prey on the common people, because the common people were untrained and unequipped, and dozens of commoners could not defeat a single knight. Thus, the nobles were able to seize power. However, the emergence and development of firearms broke this monopoly, and World War I ended it, not because of so-called chivalry or noble patriotism. The result of not having control of the sea was the loss of control over supplies. At that time, control of the French army would transfer from the British Army to the Royal Navy. Professor Fessenden was dumbfounded. He had not expected that this would be a trap, and with such serious consequences. After a long while, Professor Fessenden said to Charles with a look of horror, "I'm sorry, General, I didn't expect." "I understand, Professor," Charles nodded. "Can you leave this to me?" "Of course," Professor Fessenden readily agreed. "You will be fully responsible for the intellectual property rights and authorized production." "I will have no objections." Everything was given by Charles, and Fessenden believed that he could take it back if Charles wanted to. Then, Fessenden glanced at General Winter with a wary look, got up, and walked out of the conference room. General Winter, on the other hand, was very relaxed. He showed no embarrassment whatsoever and generously spread his hands. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant General, from my perspective, I have no choice but to do this." This made sense. As he had said before, the two had their own national positions. That's why there's a saying in China, "Those who are not of our race are sure to have different hearts." Charles nodded in understanding. "So, I had no choice but to refuse, of course," General Winter replied, then feigned regret. "We should have acted sooner." "Then, what was your reason for only acting now?" Charles was intrigued. The first victory a dozen days ago had already proven the value of the echo detector, and General Winter should have been present before Professor Fessenden then. "Because of the war," General Winter replied. Charles was puzzled. The Hasselt flanking maneuver, this was one of the reasons Charles couldn't return, but it seemed unrelated to the Royal Navy. "No," General Winter shook his head. "The German warships have new movements, which makes us nervous, so we temporarily put aside the submarine victory." Charles suddenly understood, after the submarine defeat, the Germans would definitely turn to a breakthrough with their surface fleet. Berlin, Germany, the once picturesque Sanssouci Palace was now covered in white snow. Even the fountains on the statues were frozen into icicles, like teardrops, highlighting the fear and sorrow on their faces. Inside the palace, Wilhelm II, dressed in military uniform, sat on a sofa before the fireplace with two generals. The coffee table before them, though set with red wine and pastries, remained untouched, the atmosphere heavy with tension in the firelight and silence. After a long while, Wilhelm II finally asked in a muffled voice, "With over 200,000 troops captured, you still believe in Nicholas and Erwin?" "Yes, Your Majesty," replied one of the generals, Falkenhayn, his face grim and sorrowful, yet his tone resolute. "Why?" Wilhelm II asked. "Because," Falkenhayn answered, his opponent was Charles. Wilhelm II was speechless. Charles, the man who had led the French army to an easy 5-kilometer advance at the Somme, the man who had successfully penetrated Antwerp, the man who had repeatedly used the German army as a cautionary tale to create miracles. Defeat at his hands was not a disgrace. Then Falkenhayn added, "At least in Erwin's plans, there was once hope of defeating Charles." Wilhelm II nodded in agreement. The others were terrified at the mere mention of their opponent, Charles. They dared not even face him directly. But Erwin and Nicholas dared to challenge Charles, even learning his tactics and boldly employing them on the battlefield. This alone was commendable and worthy of trust. However, Wilhelm II sighed softly, "The battlefield is realistic, General, it has no logic. There is no room for failure on the Belgian front." Belgium had only one crucial stronghold left, the Liège fortress. The Liège fortress was Belgium's gateway. Once Charles captured it, all of Belgium's forces could be concentrated there to hold it. Charles and his troops could then advance south to encircle the German forces stationed on the western front from the flank and rear, causing the entire western front to collapse. "That won't happen, Your Majesty," Falkenhayn replied. "We have heavily fortified the Liège fortress and repaired the fortifications," but inwardly, he thought that Charles would always find a weakness in the defenses and break through, and the Liège fortress might be no exception. "That would be for the best," Wilhelm II replied indifferently, lacking confidence in the outcome. After a moment of silence, Wilhelm II asked again, his voice low, "Given the current situation, it's practically impossible for us to achieve victory on land, isn't it?" Falkenhayn hesitated for a moment, then nodded with difficulty. "As long as Charles and his troops are present, we can only maintain a defensive posture." He was unwilling to admit it, but he had to. At Verdun, in Belgium, and even in the Somme region, the German army was retreating. The only difference was that the Germans were inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy in the Somme region through a defensive strategy, which could barely be considered a victory. Therefore, victory on land was essentially hopeless. Then, Wilhelm II turned his gaze to another general. "We should consider whether a naval victory is possible." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 621 Local Military Superiority. Another general was Admiral Reinhard Skier, commander of the German Ocean Fleet, his voice filled with frustration. "Your Majesty, our warships are blockaded in port by the Royal Navy and can hardly do anything." On the other hand, Skier has somehow invented some equipment that seems to allow French warships to detect submarines, rendering our strategy of using submarines to blockade enemy supply lines untenable. The image above shows German Admiral Reinhard Skier. Wilhelm II shifted his posture to face Admiral Skier more comfortably. General, it was precisely because of the defeat in the submarine war that I considered using the Navy. Skier understood Wilhelm I's meaning. If victory was possible on land or by submarine, Wilhelm I would not have resorted to the Navy. The German Navy was far too weak compared to the Royal Navy, making victory almost impossible. However, the Empire was now at its most perilous moment, having been defeated simultaneously on land and by submarines by Skier. Even more serious was the lack of any hope of victory. Falkenhayn was helpless. He and his soldiers were grateful to be spared defeat, having essentially lost all confidence in victory. The submarine warfare was so ruthless that even Charles hadn't discovered them, leaving them clueless about how to retaliate and forced to completely withdraw their attack lines. So, when would the Navy finally act? Just because the enemy was too strong, should they do nothing but sit and port and wait for the Empire to fall? If so, what was the point of investing heavily in building the Navy? It's time for the Navy to make a difference, Wilhelm I said firmly, by whatever means necessary. But, Your Majesty, Admiral Skier said, looking troubled, we only have 18 battleships, while the British Royal Navy has 33. Furthermore, due to the Allied blockade, we lack steel and funds to build more warships, while Britain's fleet continues to grow. Therefore, Wilhelm I interrupted Admiral Skier, we must find a solution now. The longer they delayed, the greater the advantage of the British Royal Navy would become. Therefore, they had to resolve the issue now. Another long silence followed, so quiet that the flickering flames could be heard. Wilhelm I waited quietly, awaiting Admiral Skier's reply. However, he understood that this would take time. After all, the difference in strength was undeniable, and expecting Admiral Skier to immediately devise a feasible plan was asking the impossible. Just as he was about to end the meeting and let Admiral Skier go back to consider, Falkenhayn broke the silence. I've thought of Charles's army, Falkenhayn said abruptly. What? Wilhelm I looked at Falkenhayn in confusion, then frowned. What use was Charles's army at this point? Could you defeat him? Admiral Skier didn't pay attention, he was considering his own problems. His gaze drifted aimlessly to the wine glass on the coffee table, which gleamed crimson in the firelight, seemingly depicting the German Navy's annihilation in a sea of blood amidst the roar of cannons. What I mean is, Falkenhayn explained, that Charles' forces always manage to win with fewer troops, and our Navy is also outnumbered by the Royal Navy. So, perhaps we can learn something from Charles' tactics, Admiral Skier replied in a deep voice. I've thought of everything I can, General, including Charles' tactics. After a pause, Admiral Skier analyzed. Charles' ability to win with fewer troops is due to his superior equipment and maneuverability, allowing him to penetrate the enemy's weak points. Our fleet, on the other hand, not only lacks these advantages against the Royal Navy, but is actually at a disadvantage. Therefore, I don't think we can learn from Charles' tactics. These words were enough to show that Admiral Skier wasn't just considering this issue now, but had been thinking about how to defeat the Royal Navy with a weaker force since the start of the war, or even before. You're right, General, Falkenhayn replied. We really can't learn from Charles' tactics in this regard. It was a fact that the German fleet was weaker than the British forces, whether in terms of quantity, quality, or the combat experience of its sailors. However, Falkenhayn turned his gaze to General Skier. I wonder if you've considered that Skier's infiltration actually creates a numerical advantage in localized areas. I mean, Skier's 1st Panzer Corps only has a little over 20,000 men, but he always uses the mobility of this force to face a weaker opponent with overwhelming numerical superiority. Ultimately, we never have enough time to muster more troops to fight him. General Skier suddenly looked up at Falkenhayn. You mean, Wilhelm I hadn't quite grasped the meaning, but he wisely remained silent, not wanting to interrupt their conversation at this moment. Falkenhayn nodded. I'm not sure if this is feasible, General, because naval warfare is very different from land warfare, but I think they have some tactical similarities, if we make good use of them. Although the British have far more warships than we do, their warships are scattered throughout the encirclement. Why don't we concentrate our forces to create local advantages, like Skier did, and then gradually take them down? Admiral Skier stared in disbelief, and after a long while, nodded. You're right, General. Although it may be difficult, it may be the only tactic that can bring us victory. So, Wilhelm I asked. This method is feasible. He seemed to understand, but still not quite. I think so, Your Majesty, Admiral Skier replied. If this tactic doesn't work, there may be no other way. Then he excitedly pulled a navigation chart from his coat pocket and spread it out on the coffee table. He looked at it for a while in the firelight, then looked up at Falkenhayn, nodded gratefully, and then turned his gaze to Wilhelm I. I believe we have room to maneuver, Your Majesty. Admiral Skier seemed to have regained his energy, his voice became strong and his pace quickened. The British fleet is relatively dispersed. We can use a small fleet to lure their squadrons out, then set up an ambush and concentrate our superior forces to encircle and annihilate them. Although we cannot decide the outcome in one go, if the Royal Navy does not have a better tactic, I mean, if they always maintain an encirclement of us, then their warships will be reduced with each defeat. Wilhelm I understood, and he exclaimed, one day, their warships will be reduced to a level comparable to ours. Yes, Admiral Skier clenched his fist excitedly, and if they concentrate their warships, it means there will be a gap in the encirclement, and they will not be able to guarantee the blockade of our fleet. Excellent. Wilhelm I stood up abruptly. Excellent tactics. Then he grabbed a glass of red wine from the coffee table. Generals, for our victory. Admiral Skier and Falkenhayn quickly grabbed their glasses and stood up, replying, for our victory. Chapter 622 The involvement of the French Navy. At the Brest shipyard, General Winter spread out a nautical chart and explained to Charles the difficulties the Royal Navy was facing. After the outbreak of war, we made some adjustments to our blockade strategy against the Germans, General Winter said, pointing to the German-occupied Heligoland Bay. Before the war, it was a coastal blockade. After the war, it shifted to the open sea, and our main forces withdrew entirely to the north. The map above shows the location of Heligoland Island. The waters east of the island are the German Heligoland Bay, Germany's most important outlet to the sea. Charles nodded. This was a wise move. Although the Royal Navy was far stronger than the German Navy, a close-range blockade of German waters was still beyond their capabilities, or rather, extremely inefficient. The reason was that Germany could use a massive number of torpedo boats to slowly wear down the Royal Navy's destroyers and even battleships, after which its larger warships could break through the blockade and even defeat the Royal Navy. But if Britain adopted a long-range blockade, Germany's torpedo boats, only suitable for coastal operations, would be rendered useless, posing no threat to the Royal Navy. General Winter pointed to the navigation map and continued, we've divided the fleet into 3 parts. Battleships and other capital ships will be mainly in the north, while the narrow English Channel in the south will be blockaded with smaller ships and mines. The middle section will be patrolled by faster ships such as destroyers and battlecruisers. At the same time, they will also escort merchant ships and strive to strengthen the connection between the northern and southern blockade lines. The above map is a simplified depiction of the British blockade of the German Navy, mainly divided into upper, middle, and lower sections. What's the problem? Charles asked. This layout and allocation seemed reasonable. Charles saw no fault with it. General Winter replied, we always thought the German fleet would only break through from the north, because the south is the narrow English Channel, and the German Navy would basically be doomed if they entered that area. Charles looked up at General Winter, a hint of surprise in his eyes. You mean, the Germans chose to break through from the south? Yes, General Winter nodded. Recently, German destroyers have been frequently harassing the southern blockade line, clearing mines, breaking nets, and even sinking several of our mine layers and torpedo boats. Charles paused, then laughed. A very clever tactic. They know your main force is in the north, and the south is your weak point. You're right, Vice Admiral. General Winter spread his hands helplessly. The problem now is that the southern blockade line is very passive. In this local area, our forces not only lack advantages but are also at a disadvantage, but we cannot recall the northern fleet, because that would allow the Germans to break through the blockade. This is an inevitable problem arising from the blockade. Although the Royal Navy was almost twice the size of the German Navy, it was divided into 3 parts, with only the main fleet in the north being stronger than the Germans. The other 2 parts were weaker. If the southern supply routes were unimportant, a complete mine blockade would prevent German warships from passing through. However, the English Channel was the most important supply line on the Western Front, and if the Germans counter-blockaded it, the consequences would be unimaginable. This seems unrelated to your desire for echo detectors, Charles said. We have a plan, General Winter explained. If our warships are equipped with a large number of echo detectors, we can increase our own submarine advantage while attacking German submarines, which might benefit the southern campaign. Charles understood. The British plan was to fight fire with fire in the south, using destroyers, submarines, and smaller vessels such as torpedo boats to wear down the main German navy. Therefore, using destroyers and echo detectors to completely suppress German submarines was crucial. Otherwise, German submarines alone would keep the British fleet constantly on the move, preventing them from organizing a counter-offensive. That might be a solution, Charles praised, but he still refused, his tone resolute. But I can't agree to it, and you know why. Winter smiled helplessly, indicating his understanding. The echo detector was related to control of supplies. If Charles agreed, he would be handing over his neck to the British. A smile played on Charles's lips, his voice tinged with smugness. We seem to have another way, to have the French fleet assist the British in blockading the English Channel. This would compensate for your forces' shortcomings in the south. What do you think? Before General Winter could answer, Charles added, as you said, we are allies, General. At the same time, we possess the echo detector, and will be mass-producing it soon. You can confidently entrust anti-submarine and escort missions to the French fleet, freeing up your warships to deal with the Germans. General Winter didn't answer, using a cup of coffee to cover his embarrassment. As a vice admiral, he had certainly considered this. This would indeed strengthen the Allied Navy and greatly benefit the blockade of the German Navy. However, this would undoubtedly relieve the French Navy of its predicament, allowing it to participate more and more in naval warfare and even rapidly develop into a powerful navy capable of rivaling the British Royal Navy. This is something the British Royal Navy is unwilling to see. More importantly, the French Navy, equipped with echolocation systems, is better suited for escorting ships because it can locate and sink submarines. But escorting merchant ships is not as simple as it seems. Over time, the British Navy will be unable to intervene and will be controlled by the French Navy, resulting in a complete monopoly of strategic resources. Why? The British Royal Navy is risking its life to protect shipping lanes from the German Navy, yet the resources are controlled by the French Navy? The British Royal Navy is risking its life to fight the enemy, while the French Navy is the one reaping the benefits? Charles saw through General Winter's thoughts and calmly said, you seem to have no other choice but to either involve the French fleet or risk defeat or being outmaneuvered by the German fleet. No need for that, General. General Winter replied coldly. We can handle it ourselves. You seem to have forgotten that the Royal Navy is the most powerful navy in the world. There's nothing we can't solve. Is that so? Charles maintained his smile, unhurried. Of course, General Winter nodded firmly. However, if your fleet could add a few destroyers to alleviate our anti-submarine burden, we could consider it. Adding a few ships was different from full participation, and this was advantageous to the Royal Navy. No problem, Charles readily agreed. Then, you have no objection to adding another 12 ships to form another anti-submarine squadron, right? General Winter hesitated for a moment, then nodded with difficulty. In fact, adding 12 ships was far from enough. This was a dilemma. On one hand, there was a strong need for anti-submarine warfare. On the other hand, they didn't want the French Navy to be involved too much. Damn it, how did Seal manage to develop an echo detector? Chapter 623. If quantity can't keep up, quality can be considered. After seeing General Winter off, Charles immediately went to see Wells. Wells owned a small villa in the shipyard, built by the sea, with a view of the naval port on one side and the endless ocean on the other. Wells loved to stand on the balcony, enjoying the sea breeze and watching the warships he had overseen sail out to sea to conquer the world. Only then could he feel power, strength, and security. However, whenever Wells thought of England across the water, this feeling would be greatly diminished, even vanished. That afternoon, after returning from the factory, Wells stood on the balcony as usual, gazing at the sea. He silently watched the other side of the ocean, pipe in his mouth, standing motionless in the cold wind, like a statue. The French Navy had declined. It could now barely be ranked fifth in the world. The naval rankings in World War I were Britain, Germany, the United States, Japan, and France. Fifth place seemed good, but Wells knew it wouldn't matter. Because the French Navy was always suppressed by the Royal Navy, just like the German Navy, it was ineffective. The only difference was that the German Navy was directly blockaded, while the French Navy was indirectly blockaded. Sir, the butler approached Wells, bowing cautiously. Someone wishes to see you. It's General Charles, he's outside." Wells was startled, his previously stagnant face suddenly brightened like a blooming flower. "Please come in." Actually, there was no need for invitation, as Wells quickly stepped outside to greet him personally. Upon seeing Charles, he warmly shook his hand, his eyes filled with surprise. "It's a pleasure to see you, General. Is this your first time at the shipyard? You should have informed me beforehand so I could have made preparations." "No need, Mr. Wells," Charles replied. Generals like Charles were wary of revealing their travel itineraries. This was something a businessman like Wells couldn't understand. The two sat down on the sofa. Wells dismissed the servants and personally poured Charles a glass of red wine. "Would you like something to eat?" Wells asked. "I'll have the servants prepare it immediately." He knew from Tycoon that the army's rations had been poor lately. "No," Charles refused, wanting to finish his work quickly and not waste time. Charles recounted the Admiral and General Winter's attempt to purchase the industrial and production rights. Wells seemed startled, his eyes widened, and he said with lingering fear, "If they buy the rights to the echo detector, the Brest shipyard is finished." Charles was puzzled. He understood that the echo detector couldn't fall into British hands. But why would the Admiral's purchase threaten the shipyard's survival? Wells explained, "France also has the Toulon shipyard to the south, General. The Admiral intends to shift his focus to the Toulon shipyard, because the Brest shipyard primarily deals with the Atlantic, while the Toulon shipyard deals with the Mediterranean." Charles suddenly understood. With a behemoth that is the British Royal Navy sitting opposite them in the Atlantic, the French Navy felt it couldn't compete and thus considered abandoning it. Abandoning this side would allow them to turn their attention to the Mediterranean. After all, the Mediterranean was just a bunch of small fry, and the French Navy was the best there. Charles smiled. "If we do that, the French Navy will never catch up with Britain, already weak." Further dividing its strength in two and shifting its focus to the Mediterranean was tantamount to surrender. "Yes," Wells sighed, his voice tinged with helplessness, "but it seems unavoidable." "You also think France can't compete with Britain?" Charles asked. "The Navy is different from the Army, General," Wells explained gravely. "It requires long-term accumulation, years, decades, unlike the Army, which can achieve victory with a few advanced equipment and excellent tactics. The tonnage was a factor, and naval battles were mostly head-on clashes of warships and cannons. Without industrial capacity and resources, everything was just a castle in the air." At this time, France was severely affected by the war, suffering from severe shortages of supplies, and naval construction had essentially come to a standstill. Wells then added, "I'm sorry, General. You may not want to hear this, but it's the truth. Even with more advanced torpedoes and echo sounders, we still can't change this. For example, right now, our Navy can only participate in combat to a limited extent under the command of the Royal Navy, and there are even dangers." Charles looked at Wells with suspicion. "Dangers?" Wells nodded helplessly. "The British aren't as simple as you think. General Winter said they can handle it themselves. Have you thought about how they'll handle it?" Charles didn't speak. It was a classified matter, and he didn't believe Wells knew the reason. Wells raised his glass and lightly clinked it against Charles's. "One thing I can think of is that our warships might encounter some accidents during missions, such as being sunk by German submarines or striking mines, etc. This is unavoidable, don't you think?" Charles understood. "Then, the British can obtain the echo detector." Wells hummed in agreement, then countered, "Why not? They can prepare in advance and rescue the warships as quickly as possible, ultimately destroying the evidence with explosives." "What can we do then?" Charles fell silent. This was something he hadn't considered. However, it was indeed possible, and very likely. In the face of national interests, especially the possibility of Charles controlling and blockading all supplies, what did such a despicable tactic matter? Besides, the opponent was the notoriously shameless Minister of Munitions. After considering for a moment, Charles thoughtfully said, "It seems necessary to remind Professor Fessenden that we should install a self-destruct device. Not much explosive is needed, just enough to destroy the core." Wells's eyes lit up. "A self-destruct device? A good idea. This way, the British will have to go through even more trouble to acquire this technology." But Wells's expression immediately darkened. "The more serious problem is that our steel and coal mines have long been under German control, which has led to a widening gap between our Navy and Britain. Competing with them seems unrealistic. Britain, thanks to American loans and the fact that its domestic resources weren't affected by the battlefield, was in a much better situation than France." Charles nodded in understanding, but he didn't give up. If we can't catch up in quantity, we can consider quality, Charles said. Quality. Wells looked at Charles, puzzled. He didn't understand. Who could surpass Britain in building warships? Chapter 624 Naval Asymmetric Tactics. Charles didn't answer Wells directly. Instead, he asked, Mr. Wells, before we proceed, I'd like to confirm one thing. Do you have a reliable research and development team? Of course, General, Wells replied confidently. I have a research and development team completely under my control, one that even the military has no right to interfere with. Charles nodded. This is characteristic of countries with private ownership. Patents and technologies for equipment are often held by large capitalists, not the state. These capitalists aren't stupid. They know that as long as they hold on to these technologies tightly, they can sell a bag of screws for $90,000 and a single shell for $800,000, just like in modern America. Therefore, they are extremely secretive, even if it sometimes requires suicide of their own people. Then, I think we can improve the fire control system, Charles replied. The fire control system currently used on our warships is two-way stabilizing, isn't it? Yes, a hint of surprise flashed in Wells' eyes. Charles actually knew about two-way stabilized fire control systems? But then he thought it made perfect sense. Charles wasn't just a general, he was also a genius inventor, having recently invented landing craft in amphibious landing ships, and possessing in-depth research on torpedoes. It wasn't surprising that he knew about two-way stabilized fire control systems. Charles pointed out the answer. We should invest in developing a three-way stabilized fire control system to improve the accuracy of naval guns. Three-way stabilizing. Wells's admiration for Charles deepened. Even he, someone who had worked in shipbuilding for years, had never heard of such a system. Yes, Charles felt a little thirsty, picked up his glass, took a small sip, and continued. We all know that pitch also affects the accuracy of naval guns, so a two-way stabilization system alone is insufficient. Far from enough. Wells looked at Charles with admiration. The impact of pitch on naval gun accuracy was still at the exploratory and verification stage. Even researchers didn't know much about it. He hadn't expected Charles to know. What Wells didn't know was that Charles was intentionally misleading him. The third factor affecting naval gun accuracy wasn't pitch, but roll. The Germans, mistaking pitch for roll, failed to improve accuracy significantly until 6 years later when they discovered it was slide. Charles did this to protect Wells. He knew capitalists were profit-driven, and expecting their loyalty was unrealistic, even foolish. Therefore, Charles needed to maintain a long-term grip on these capitalists and technologies. More importantly, if the Germans or British heard the news, they would be misled by Charles's proposed pitch theory. When necessary, Charles could make the final decision. Oh, how about we try modifying the third direction to target slide? This wouldn't take long, but the effects would be immediate, and the initiative would always remain in Charles's hands. Wells nodded thoughtfully. If this technology is successfully developed, it can indeed improve the quality of our warships, even achieve a qualitative leap. In naval warfare, this is the difference between accurate and inaccurate shooting, allowing one French Navy ship to have the firepower of 2 or even 3. Given the inability to build ships, this was indeed a way to improve strength. But then Wells slowly shook his head. His tone heavy. It seems feasible, General. But research and development takes time, and after successful development, the fire control systems of all the ship's guns need to be upgraded, which also takes time, especially upgrading the large guns of battleships, which is even more difficult, or even impossible. A distant solution cannot quench an immediate thirst. In comparison, shifting the strategic focus to Toulon is still more realistic. We'll only upgrade the destroyers, Charles interrupted Wells. Only upgrade the destroyers? Wells frowned. Upgrading only the destroyers might be much simpler, but when facing heavily armored battleships, the accuracy of the destroyer's gun seems to make little difference. Note, at this time, destroyers were generally small in tonnage, and their small-caliber guns were unlikely to inflict effective damage on battleships. Have you heard of asymmetric warfare? Charles asked calmly. Wells looked bewildered. He was a businessman. Although he had shipbuilding experience, he didn't know much about tactics, and asymmetric warfare was completely unheard of. Simply put, Charles explained, it's about maximizing your advantages in a particular area during war, and then using those advantages to completely crush the corresponding branch of the enemy. Then, the enemy will be severely hampered by the lack of that particular branch, ultimately lowering their overall combat effectiveness and putting them on the defensive. Wells seemed to understand, but not quite. But this doesn't seem to have anything to do with their confrontation with the Royal Navy. Charles reminded him, just upgrade the destroyers. They have more accurate guns and new torpedoes, so they can have an overwhelming advantage over the Royal Navy's destroyers and torpedo boats. Wells suddenly realized, General, you mean we can use our destroyers to completely crush the Royal Navy's destroyer and torpedo boat forces? Yes, Charles nodded, then asked, it's not difficult to do that, is it? Wells hesitated for a moment, then said confidently, it's not difficult. Our destroyers are faster than battleships, so we can always operate outside their firing range. Once the British send destroyers to pursue, they will be sunk by our destroyers' overwhelming superiority in guns and torpedoes. Next, Charles smiled slightly, you can assume that the Royal Navy has lost most of its destroyers, or even torpedo boats, and then seize that opportunity to expand your gains. Wells suddenly realized, then we can use destroyers and torpedo boats to besiege the enemy's battleships and cruisers. The logic was simple. Battleships of this era were vulnerable to torpedo boats. Even the strongest and most advanced battleships were often killed with a single shot. The massive guns on battleships were largely ineffective against these fast, small torpedo boats. Their penetrating power and firepower were practically useless, like using a cannon to kill a mosquito. Even if a few were sunk by chance, the loss to the French fleet would be negligible. Destroyers were the natural enemy of torpedo boats. They were fast and equipped with small to medium caliber guns, making them more effective against torpedo boats. But if the French fleet's destroyers overwhelmed and utterly crushed the British destroyers, it would trigger a chain reaction like the first domino to fall, ultimately leading to the complete collapse of the seemingly powerful Royal Navy. Wells suddenly stood up, his face flushed with excitement, even his breathing became rapid. This did indeed seem like a solution, a very good and brilliant one. But soon, he calmed down. But General, if the British adopt a long-range blockade strategy like they did with the Germans, we may not be able to use this asymmetric warfare tactic. Chapter 625 Control of the Strait. Charles understood Wells's meaning. Torpedo boats were only suitable for coastal operations. For long-range warfare, they couldn't withstand rough seas and couldn't carry enough fuel. But Charles wasn't in a hurry. He calmly replied, the same tactic can be used, the only difference is replacing the torpedo boats with destroyers. Wells instantly understood. It was the same strategy, using the speed of destroyers to maneuver in guerrilla warfare against the enemy fleet, then using destroyers to launch torpedo attacks on the battleships after the enemy destroyers were nearly wiped out. So, we need to build a large number of destroyers, am I right, General? Wells concluded excitedly, gesturing wildly. I mean, we need to continue to expand our advantages. That is, our destroyers must not only outnumber the Royal Navy in terms of quality, but also in terms of sheer numbers. Charles nodded in agreement, indicating that Wells had grasped the essence of asymmetric warfare, that is, to make one's strengths even stronger. Wells was ecstatic, pacing back and forth in front of the sofa as he analyzed. I think you're right, so speed is more important, isn't it? Speed, coupled with sound tactics, will allow us to defeat the enemy's seemingly powerful battleships with destroyers. That's what you meant when you said destroyers would be the future. I had my doubts about that before, but now it seems you were right, absolutely right. Then he paused. It's just a pity we built over 200 torpedo boats. They might not be very effective. This was a problem left over from the French Green Water Navy ideology, where the French Navy hoped to use torpedo boats as its main force. Although torpedo boats weren't expensive, over 200 was still a significant expense. However, Charles answered confidently, they will be useful, very useful. What? Wells didn't understand. Once the British fleet implemented a long-range blockade strategy, the torpedo boats wouldn't be able to reach them, so why would they be useful? Charles didn't answer. He looked around, stood up, picked up the nautical chart from his desk, spread it on the coffee table, and pointed to the map, saying, this is the location of the Brest shipyard. Do you see anything? The marked point on the map indicates the location of the Brest shipyard. It's situated at the exit of the English Channel, offering both offensive and defensive advantages, and its western border with the Atlantic Ocean makes it difficult to blockade. Wells stared at the map for a moment, then exclaimed, I understand. Torpedo boats can be used to blockade the La Manche Strait, not just blockade, Mr. Wells, Charles added. Once our navy enters the La Manche Strait, we will be invincible. The entire strait will be our safe haven. Wells was stunned, then his eyes widened and he shouted excitedly, grabbing Charles's shoulders and shaking him vigorously, "You're right, General. As long as our destroyers have an absolute advantage, we will have absolute advantage in the strait, even without battleships. Fantastic. You're a genius, unbelievable. Our Navy will defeat the Royal Navy, the world's #1 Royal Navy." The Strait of La Manche is 220 kilometers wide at its widest point and only 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest, a distance within the operational range of torpedo boats. If the British Royal Navy were to blockade from the Atlantic, torpedo boats would be ineffective, leaving France with only destroyers to act as torpedo boats in the encirclement. However, once the Royal Navy entered the strait, under asymmetric warfare, the British fleet would face a massive siege by French destroyers and torpedo boats, essentially guaranteeing the destruction of its battleships and cruisers. On the surface, the French Navy might appear to have achieved only a partial victory, controlling the Strait of La Manche, but lacking significant advantage beyond it. But for Britain, the world's leading navy, it was a complete defeat, a disgrace, and the total collapse of its naval power, international prestige, and even its colonies. This was something Britain could not tolerate. Charles continued, "What we need to do is build more ports along the La Manche Strait, which can supply the torpedo boats. Because the torpedo boats are fast, they can be quickly mobilized from various ports to the combat zone during wartime." Wells nodded repeatedly, "I'll report this plan to the Navy immediately. God, if they approve of this plan, the strategic focus will still be on the Brest shipyard. No, they will definitely approve of this plan. They have no reason not to." This was a plan that could potentially defeat the Royal Navy. If anyone disagreed, there was only one reason: they were a mouthpiece for the British, a traitor to France. Therefore, even members of Parliament dared not easily veto it. "We also need to build large landing craft," Charles said abruptly. "Landing craft?" Wells looked at Charles in astonishment. "Why, build landing craft?" Charles tapped London's location on the map with his finger. "Once we have full control of the La Manche Channel, it's possible to launch a surprise attack on London from the British mainland, sir." Wells smiled knowingly. "Yes, General, large landing craft, build them for the British to see." Indeed, they were being built for the British. France was unlikely to fight Britain, they were allies at the moment, and future conflicts were foreseeable. But since Britain was being considered a hypothetical enemy and to be surpassed, actual combat had to be considered. Unlike a real enemy, this tactic needed to be subtly revealed to the British. Only in this way could the British feel a sense of crisis, realize they were being held hostage by France, and then make political concessions. Of course, this was only Charles's first step. In his mind, airfields should also be built along the La Manche Channel. The future model for controlling the La Manche Channel would be to use fighter jets to seize air superiority, and then use bombers and torpedo bombers in conjunction with the Navy to seize sea control. Britain's heavily invested and prized pre-dreadnought, dreadnought, and super-dreadnought battleships were all easy targets. As long as Charles maintained his air superiority, the so-called world's #1 Navy was utterly insignificant and could be easily wiped out. These were Air Force issues, and Charles didn't see much need to discuss them with Wells. Finally, while toasting with Wells, Charles casually remarked, "I'm planning to send a few people to the shipyard to learn about two-way stabilization technology. Is that all right?" Wells readily agreed. Of course not, he had no reason to refuse. Charles's assets all produced army equipment, posing no competition to the shipyard. In fact, there was no competition. Charles hoped to transplant the Navy's two-way stabilization fire control technology to tanks. Of course, this would be a completely new patent, controlled by Charles. As for Wells's shipyard, Charles wasn't worried. The more time passed, the greater the importance of air superiority in naval warfare would become. One day, Wells would understand that he couldn't do without Charles, because leaving meant death. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.